Welcome to Soft History Stories. In 1891, a coal miner in Pennsylvania descended deeper beneath the earth than anyone in the state had ever ventured before. He wasn't searching for treasure. He wasn't searching for the past. He was looking for coal, the same black seams that fed the furnaces, and the railroads, and the saddle, fortunes of an entire industrial nation. But somewhere below the last recorded depth, past the point where his lamp should have shown him nothing but rock and dust, his pick broke through into something that was not supposed to exist. Not another seam, not a pocket of gas, something built, something old, something that, when word of it finally reached the surface, made grown men go quiet in a way that cold dust and cave-ins never had. Stay with me tonight, because this is one of those stories that the history books skipped over. The kind of story that surfaces every few decades in old newspaper clippings and forgotten geological surveys, only to sink back into silence before anyone official has to answer for it. We're going to walk through what happened underneath that small Pennsylvania town in 1891, slowly, carefully, the way the miners themselves moved through that passage with nothing but oil lamps and nerve. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe, and let me know where are you right now, and what time is it. The town doesn't appear on many modern maps the way it once did, not under the name it carried in 1891, because towns like it rarely survived the century that built them. It existed because of coal, and it would eventually die because of coal too. But in 1891, it was very much alive, a cluster of frame houses and company stores strung along a single muddy road that ran parallel to the rail line. Smoke sat low over the rooftops most mornings, not from chimneys alone, but from the breaker towers at the edge of town, where coal was crushed and sorted by machines that never seemed to stop, day or night, running on a rhythm that everyone who lived there had long since stopped hearing as noise. It was simply the sound the world made. Children grew up with it, the way children elsewhere grew up with crickets or church bells. And men who had worked the seams for 30 years said they could tell what time it was by the particular grinding pitch the breaker made. As the afternoon wore on and the gears warmed, this was anthracite country, the hard coal region of northeastern Pennsylvania, where the seams ran deep and twisted and unforgiving, nothing like the soft, bituminous coal found further west and south. Anthracite burned hotter and cleaner, which made it valuable, which made the men who dug it valuable too, in the cold economic sense that mattered to the companies that owned the land and the rights beneath it. By 1891, those companies had been pushing their shafts deeper for the better part of 2 decades, chasing seams that ran at angles no one could have predicted from the surface, following coal the way a man follows a stream uphill, never quite sure where it leads, but unwilling to stop walking. The deeper they went, the more money it cost to go further, and the more money it cost, the more pressure came down from the company offices in Philadelphia and New York to justify every foot of new shaft, with tonnage pulled up behind it. The miner at the center of this story was not famous before that year, and in most of the official record, he barely became famous after it either, which is itself part of what makes this story strange. He was, by every surviving account, an ordinary man in the way that most men who built America's industrial backbone were ordinary, meaning he was extraordinary in ways nobody bothered to write down. He had come up through the mines the way most boys in that region did, starting as what they called a breaker boy, sorting slate from coal with hands that bled in winter from the cold and the sharp edges of broken rock, before graduating to the deeper, more dangerous work underground, once he was old enough and strong enough to be trusted with a pick, a lamp. By the time he was in his 30s, he had developed the particular instinct that the best miners possessed, and that no company training could replicate, an almost physical sense for where rock was about to fail, for the difference in sound between solid stone and stone that was about to give way, for the faint changes in air pressure that meant gas was building somewhere unseen. He was known among the other men for being careful in a profession that did not reward, carefulness with speed, and speed was what the foreman wanted, because speed meant tonnage, and tonnage meant the company stayed profitable, and the town stayed employed. There is a particular tension that runs through every account of deep coal mining in this era, a tension between the men who understood that the earth did not care about quotas, and the companies who needed quotas met anyway. And that tension sits underneath everything that happened in the weeks before the discovery, like a seam of its own, waiting. The shaft he was working that year had been sunk a few years earlier, and had been chasing a seam that kept dipping lower than the surveys predicted, lower than anyone in the company office had budgeted for, which created exactly the kind of friction that makes men push past where they should stop. The company wanted the seam. The seam kept running deeper, and so the shaft kept following it down past depths that had previously been considered the practical limit for this particular section of the coal field, into territory that the surveyors themselves admitted they had no good maps for, because nobody had ever needed maps that deep before. This was the edge of what was known, not metaphorically, but literally, a few 100 feet of fresh excavation that existed nowhere on paper except in the daily notes. The foreman kept hastily by lamplight, in notebooks that would later become difficult for historians to track down. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment, because it matters for everything that follows. This was not an established mine with decades of careful surveying behind it. This was new ground, freshly opened, the kind of place where geological surprises were not just possible, but almost expected, because nobody before this crew had ever stood at that particular depth and looked at that particular rock face. The miners who worked it knew this. They talked about it in the way men talk about uncertainty when they have no choice but to keep working inside it, with dark humor and superstition and small private rituals that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the simple human need to feel some control over a situation, where control was mostly an illusion. There were already stories circulating before the discovery, the kind of stories that tend to grow in places where men spend 10 or 12 hours a day in absolute darkness, broken only by the thin yellow light of an oil lamp clipped to a cap. Miners in that shaft had reported strange currents of air coming from sections of rock that should have been solid, cold drafts that smelled faintly of something mineral and unfamiliar, not the usual smell of sulfur or damp stone, but something else. Something that more than one man described independently as smelling almost like old water. Water that had been sitting somewhere untouched for a very long time. Sound traveled strangely down there too. Men said, echoes that seemed to come from the wrong direction. Taps and shifts in the rock that didn't match the rhythm of anyone's pick. Most of this was almost certainly the ordinary acoustic strangeness of deep rock, where sound bends and travels along seams and fractures in ways that can fool even experienced ears, but almost certainly is doing a lot of work in that sentence. And the miners themselves were not so sure. The foreman in charge of that section, a man whose name appears in company records, but who left behind almost no personal account beyond a handful of tour entries in a shift log, had apparently grown frustrated enough with the slow pace of digging through this unpredictable rock that he authorized the use of additional charges to speed up the breakthrough into what the surveyors believed was the next pocket of the seam. This is the detail that historians who have looked into this case keep returning to, because it means that what happened next was not the result of careful incremental excavation. It was the result of a deliberate decision to blast through faster than caution would normally allow, in pursuit of a coal seam that, as it turned out, was not actually where anyone expected it to be. The blast went off on what the surviving records suggest was a Tuesday late in the afternoon shift, the kind of timing that meant the explosion's aftermath would be discovered, not by the full crew, but by a smaller group finishing out the day's work, while most of the others had already been pulled back to safer ground. Among that smaller group was the miner this story follows, and according to the only detailed first-hand account that survives, written down years later and preserved almost by accident in a private collection rather than any official archive, he was the first man back into the blast site once the dust had settled enough to breathe. What he expected to find was rock, freshly fractured, maybe coal if they were lucky, maybe nothing, but more barren stone if they weren't. What he found instead, according to that account, was a hole in the world that should not have been there. Not a natural cavity, not the kind of void that sometimes opens up in coal country when underground water has worked through soft rock for centuries. This was different. The edges where the blast had torn through were sharp and regular, in a way that natural stone almost never is, framing an opening into a space beyond that swallowed the light from his lamp instead of reflecting it back in the dull mineral way that raw coal and shale usually did. He stood at that opening for what he later described as a long time, though in the account it is clear he himself was unsure how long. Because time behaves strangely in moments like that, stretched and compressed by adrenaline in ways that defy a normal clock, he called out. Nothing answered, except the echo which came back wrong, layered as if it were bouncing off surfaces much further away, and much more numerous than a simple tunnel would produce. He held his lamp forward into the opening, and saw just at the edge of what the light could reach, the suggestion of a surface that was not rough stone at all, but something with edges, something with a regularity to it that every instinct his years underground had given him said should not exist at that depth, in that rock, in a place where, as far as anyone on the surface knew, no human being had ever set foot before. That is where we will leave him for now, standing at the edge of a hole that should not have existed, his lamp throwing a small circle of light into a darkness that had apparently been waiting undisturbed for longer than anyone in that mine, in that town, or perhaps in that entire region of the country could have imagined. In the next part of this story, we are going to step back and understand exactly where this mine sat in the landscape, why this particular stretch of Pennsylvania already carried a quiet, half-buried reputation for things that did not fit the official version of American history, and why the company that owned this shaft would spend the better part of the next decade trying very hard to make sure this moment never became more than a rumor. To understand why this discovery mattered so much, and why it frightened the people who needed to keep digging coal more than they wanted to understand what they had found, you have to understand the ground itself, not just the rock, but the long, strange history of what people already believed about what might be buried beneath the hills of Pennsylvania before a single shaft had ever been sunk into them. This was not virgin territory for stories about things that did not belong in conventional history. Long before anthroid companies started chasing seams 2,000 feet down, the surface world above them had already produced its own quiet tradition of unexplained finds, the kind of finds that tend to get a paragraph in a county history book and then vanish from public memory entirely, because nobody in a position of authority wanted to follow the thread any further than that paragraph allowed. Pennsylvania, and the broader Ohio and Mississippi Valley region that stretched out to its west, had been producing reports of enormous earthworks and burial mounds since the earliest days of European settlement. Structures so large and so geometrically precise that the first surveyors who encountered them assumed almost reflexively that no indigenous population could have built them. This assumption tells you more about the surveyors than about the structures, but it became for a time something close to consensus among educated Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries. The mounds, they reasoned, must have been built by some earlier, more advanced race, a race that had vanished or been destroyed long before any of the tribes encountered by European settlers had arrived. This idea, sometimes called the myth of the mound builders, was not fringe thinking in the way it sounds today. It was discussed in serious scientific circles, debated in the halls of early American learned societies, and used often quite deliberately as justification for displacing the very indigenous communities who might otherwise have been recognized as the actual builders of these monuments. By the time our miner was working his shaft in 1891, the scientific consensus on the mound builder question was beginning to shift slowly, uncomfortably toward the conclusion that indigenous peoples themselves had built these structures, a conclusion that should have been obvious from the start, but that had been resisted for decades because it complicated the narrative many Americans wanted to tell about the land they had taken. The Smithsonian Institution, through its Bureau of Ethnology, had been conducting a sweeping survey of these mounds throughout the 1880s, sending teams across the eastern half of the continent to measure, excavate, and catalogue thousands of sites in what was at the time one of the largest archaeological undertakings, the Collet in Liti. That survey would eventually produce a report, published just a few years after the events in this story, that formally dismantled the lost race theory and credited indigenous nations with the construction of the mounds. But surveys like that move slowly, and consensus among scientists in Washington does not travel quickly into coal towns in the Pennsylvania hills, where men who spent their days underground had their own folk knowledge of what might be down there, passed along through generations of digging and occasional unsettling discovery. Miners in this region had on more than one occasion before 1891 broken into pockets and chambers that did not match the surrounding geology, finding fragments of workstone, pieces of pottery, and in at least 2 documented cases that predate our central story, human remains positioned in ways that suggested deliberate burial rather than accident at depths that made no sense for any burial practice anyone could readily explain. These finds were reported briefly in regional newspapers, treated with a kind of beused curiosity, and then largely forgotten, filed away in the part of the public memory reserved for things that are interesting but inconvenient. What made the region around our miners' town distinct, even among other parts of Anthroid country, was a specific and persistent local legend that predated the mine itself. A story that the town's older residents, particularly those of Welsh and Pennsylvania Dutch descent, who had been farming that land before the coal companies arrived, told about a particular ridge a few miles from where the shaft was eventually sunk. According to the version of the story collected decades later by a folklorist working for a regional historical society, the ridge was avoided by the area's earliest farmers, not out of fear exactly, but out of a kind of inherited caution, the sort of caution people maintain about a place even after they have forgotten the specific reason for it. The story held that the ridge was hollow, not in the ordinary sense of containing a cave, but hollow the way a drum is hollow, meaning that certain sounds made on the surface of it produced echoes that did not match what you would expect from solid earth. There was also in that same collected folklore a fragment of a story about lights, not lights in the sky, which is the kind of folklore that tends to survive cleanly into the chapter, because it fits neatly into later traditions of unexplained aerial phenomena, but lights from the ground itself, faint and intermittent, seen by a handful of residents over the better part of a century, always near that same ridge, always at night, always described in the same frustratingly vague terms, a kind of dim glow that seemed to come from beneath the surface rather than upon it. Nobody who told this story claimed to have investigated it directly. The land around the ridge was rocky, difficult to farm, and largely left alone, which meant that whatever was producing those lights, if anything was producing them at all, and this was not simply a trick of marsh gas or reflected moonlight, was never disturbed long enough for anyone to get a clear look. The mine that would eventually produce the discovery at the center of this story was not sunk directly into that ridge. It was sunk into the valley adjacent to it, following the geological logic of coal seams rather than any local superstition. And for the first several years of its operation, nobody connected the two. Coal mining and ridge folklore occupied entirely separate categories in the minds of most people in that town, one being a serious economic reality that put food on the table, and the other being the kind of story told to children to keep them away from dangerous, unstable ground. It was only after the events of 1891, when men who had grown up hearing the ridge stories found themselves staring into a chamber that should not have existed at a depth that made no geological sense, that the older residents began quietly suggesting that the mine had simply tunneled by accident into the edge of whatever the ridge had always been hiding. This connection, speculative as it was and remains, matters for one specific reason that becomes important later in this story. If the chamber the miner found was connected to whatever lay beneath that ridge, then it was not an isolated pocket created by some freak accident of geology or a single contained structure, built and abandoned in one place. It suggested something larger, a system, a network of spaces beneath that landscape that extended for some unknown distance, threading through rock that the coal companies had been blasting through for years without any sense of what they might eventually be cutting into. And if that was true, then the discovery our miner made was not the whole story. It was simply the first piece of it to surface, the first thread that someone happened to pull in a tapestry that had been quietly waiting under the hills of Pennsylvania for far longer than anyone in that town or in that century was prepared to understand. Back at the blast site, the miner did not go in alone, not at first. And this detail matters because it means what happened next was not the product of one man's imagination or one man's account, told and retold until it grew in the telling. There were, according to the surviving record, 3 other men present in that section of the shaft when the breakthrough occurred. Men whose names appear scattered across payroll ledgers and the occasional company memo, but who, like the central figure of this story, left behind almost nothing in their own words. One of them, the oldest of the group, had nearly 30 years underground behind him, and had, by his own later account, relayed second-hand through a relative, seen exactly 2 things in his career that he could not explain through ordinary geology. And this discovery would become the third. The 4 men stood at the opening for a period of time that none of them later agreed on precisely, which is itself a small detail worth noting, because miners in this era were generally careful about time, trained by necessity to track shift hours and blast timing with real precision. Their disagreement about how long they stood there, ranging in later retellings from a few minutes to what one man insisted was closer to half an hour, suggests something about the disorienting nature of the moment itself, the kind of temporal confusion that tends to accompany genuine shock rather than ordinary observation. What finally moved them forward was not curiosity alone, but a practical, almost mundane concern, the kind that governed every decision a miner made underground. The air. One of the men, the same with 30 years of experience, held his lamp close to the opening and watched the flame, the oldest and most reliable instrument any miner had for detecting dangerous gas. A flame that burns low or guttering signals a depletion of oxygen. A flame that burns unusually tall and blue can signal the presence of methane, and a flame that simply goes out is the signal every miner is trained from his first week underground to respect without question, because it usually means death is close behind it. The flame, by his account, did neither of these things. It burned steady, and if anything, slightly brighter than it had in the tunnel behind them, which suggested, counterintuitively, that whatever lay beyond that opening was not a sealed, oxygen-starved pocket, but something connected, somehow, to a larger source of air, which raised an immediate and uncomfortable question. Connected to what, and reaching how far, and ventilated by whom? This was the detail that convinced the oldest miner to step through first. A lamp extended, the other 3 following close behind him, in the loose single file that men adopt instinctively when moving through unfamiliar darkness. The passage beyond the blast opening was narrow at first, narrow enough that a man's shoulders brushed both sides, and the walls here, unlike the rough, blasted stone immediately behind them, were smooth, not polished in the way a finished stone floor in a building might be polished, but worn smooth, the kind of smoothness that comes from long exposure to moving water, or from deliberate, careful shaping by tools. And in the lamplight, it was difficult for any of the 4 men to say with certainty which explanation applied, only that the wall did not feel like the raw column rock they had spent years learning to read with their hands as much as their eyes. The passage ran for what one of the 4 estimated at perhaps 60 feet before it opened, suddenly and without warning, into a space that their lamps could not fully illuminate. This is the point in every later retelling of the story where the account becomes both most vivid and most frustratingly vague, because the men were describing the experience of seeing something at the absolute edge of available light in a moment of significant fear underground. in conditions where every sense was already primed by years of training to interpret darkness as potential danger. What they agreed on across every version of the story that survives was that the space was large, larger than any natural cavity any of them had encountered in their combined decades of work. Large enough that the small circle of light from 4 oil lamps held together in the center of it did not reach any of the surrounding walls, only a vague suggestion of where they might be. Somewhere beyond the reach of the flame, the floor beneath their feet in this larger chamber was different again from the smooth-walled passage that had led them there. It was uneven, scattered with what felt underfoot like loose rubble, and at least 2 of the men later reported stepping on or near objects that were clearly not natural stone fragments, objects with edges too regular, too deliberate to be the product of any rockfall or collapse. One of these objects, picked up and examined by lamplight, was later described in the single, surviving written account that goes into the most detail as a flat piece of stone, roughly the size of a man's palm, worked on one side into a series of shallow parallel grooves, evenly spaced, that none of the 4 men recognized as belonging to any tool or technique they had ever encountered in their work, mining or otherwise. It is worth pausing here to be honest about the limits of what we can verify almost 130 years later. The objects these men described handling that day did not, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever make their way into a museum collection, a university archive, or any institution with the resources and motivation to properly study and preserve them. What we have instead is testimony second-hand and third-hand in places, filtered through the memories of men who were by every account frightened, working in dangerous conditions, and entirely unequipped by training or by the standards of the time to properly document an archaeological find. This does not mean their testimony is worthless. It means we have to treat it the way careful historians treat any uncorroborated account from people who had every reason to tell the truth and no apparent reason to lie, which is to say, with serious interest and appropriate caution in equal measure. What happened next, according to the account that survives, was that the oldest miner, the one with 30 years underground, and 2 previous unexplained encounters behind him, made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He called the group back, not because anything in the chamber had directly threatened them. No collapse, no gas, no sound or movement beyond the strange layered echo their own voices, produced in that open space, but because he recognized with the particular instinct that experienced miners developed for situations beyond their authority to handle, that this was not something 4 men with picks and oil lamps should be exploring further on their own in the dwindling hours of an afternoon shift, with no surveying equipment, no proper lighting, and no one above ground who knew where they actually were. They retreated back through the narrow passage, back through the blast site, and back up toward the surface, carrying with them the worked stone fragment, and by at least one account, a second object that one of the younger men had pocketed without fully examining it in the dim light below. They did not, according to every surviving record, tell the other men on their shift what they had found. Not immediately, not in any detail. What they did instead was go directly to the foreman, the same man who had authorized the additional blasting charges that had opened the passage in the first place. And it is in that conversation, held in a small company office at the surface, as the light outside was already beginning to fail, that the story stops belonging entirely to the miners and starts belonging in a way that would prove consequential for years afterward to the company that employed them. The foreman's reaction, as it was later described by at least 2 of the men who were present in that office, was not what any of the 4 expected. He did not dismiss them, which might have been the easiest response, and the one most foreman of that era would have reached for instinctively, when faced with 4 exhausted men describing something that sounded on its face like superstition or fatigue talking. He also did not immediately express the kind of excitement that a genuine career-making discovery might have produced in a different sort of man. Instead, according to the account, he grew quiet, turned the worked stone fragment over in his hands several times under the lamp on his desk, and, asked a series of questions that suggested he was thinking less about the discovery itself, and more about what it would mean for the operation of the mine. This reaction makes more sense once you understand the position the company was in that year. The shaft had already cost more than projected. The seam it was chasing had proven unpredictable and expensive to follow, and the entire operation existed under constant pressure from ownership in Philadelphia to either produce results or justify why it had not. A discovery like the one the four miners were describing represented from a pure business standpoint two simultaneous and contradictory problems. On one hand, if word of an ancient chamber beneath the property got out, it could attract the kind of attention, scientific and otherwise, that might delay operations indefinitely, while researchers and government surveyors picked through ground the company needed to keep mining. On the other hand, if the company tried to simply seal the passage and continue working as though nothing had happened, and word leaked out anyway through the ordinary channels of small-town gossip that no company could ever fully control, it would look at best evasive and at worst like exactly the kind of deliberate suppression of an important find that would draw far more scrutiny than if they had simply reported it honestly from the start. The foreman, according to the surviving account, chose a third path, one that was neither full disclosure nor full suppression, but a kind of careful, controlled middle ground that, in retrospect, ended up satisfying almost no one. He instructed the four men to say nothing to the rest of the crew, beyond the fact that the blast had opened into what he described in the instructions he gave them as an unstable natural cavity, dangerous enough to warrant immediate sealing for safety reasons. This was not strictly speaking a lie, since the chamber was genuinely unsurveyed and genuinely could have posed real dangers to men working without proper support, but it was also just as clearly a framing chosen specifically to discourage curiosity rather than to accurately convey what the men had actually found. That same night, before the next shift began, a small crew under the foreman's direct supervision returned to the blast site and did exactly what the instructions suggested they would. They sealed the narrow passage with timber and loose rubble, not a full masonry wall, which would have required time and materials the company was not yet willing to commit, but enough of a barrier that no one wandering through that section of the mine would stumble into the opening by accident. The four original miners were reassigned within the week to a different section of the operation, a transfer that the company's own ledgers record as routine reassignment, but that at least one of the men later described in conversation with a relative as something closer to being deliberately separated and kept too busy to compare notes with each other or with anyone else. It would be easy looking back from this distance to read this entirely as a sinister cover-up, the kind of story we have all become accustomed to expecting from powerful institutions, protecting their financial interests at the expense of the truth. And there is good reason to believe that explanation captures a real part of what happened. But the full picture, as best as it can be reconstructed from the fragments that survive, is somewhat more complicated than simple villain, and understanding that complication matters for what comes next in this story. The foreman did not, as far as any record shows, attempt to destroy or dispose of the two objects the miners had brought up from the chamber. Instead, he kept them first in his own office, and then within a few weeks in a small wooden box that he apparently sent by a means that remains unclear in the surviving correspondence to a private contact of his outside the company, a man whose identity is one of the more frustrating gaps in this entire story. That contact referred to in the one surviving letter connected to this exchange only by a surname that does not match any prominent geologist, archaeologist, or academic figure of the period that researchers have been able to identify with confidence, appears to have had some background in what the letter vaguely describes as antiquarian interests, a catch-all term in that era for amateur collectors and self-taught scholars of ancient artifacts who operated largely outside the formal academic institutions of the time. This detail suggests that the foreman, whatever his motivations for keeping the company's official involvement minimal, was genuinely curious about what the men had found, and wanted some kind of expert opinion on it, even if he was unwilling or unable to pursue that opinion through official channels that might have exposed the company to the kind of scrutiny he was trying to avoid. The letter itself, dated several weeks after the discovery, and preserved today only because it was tucked apparently by accident into the pages of an unrelated company ledger that survived a later fire that destroyed most of the operation's other records, is frustratingly brief. It describes the two objects only in the most general terms, references a workstone fragment, and what it calls, in language that has produced no small amount of speculation among the handful of researchers who have examined this letter in the decades since its rediscovery, a small carved figure of uncertain material. It asks the recipient for his honest assessment of their age and origin, and it closes with a line that has become among the small community of people who take this story seriously perhaps the single most quoted sentence connected to the entire affair. The foreman wrote in his own hand that he did not believe these objects had been carried into that chamber by any man currently living, or any man whose grandfather had lived, and that he would rather know the truth privately than have the company forced to explain it publicly before anyone understood what it actually meant. We do not have the response to that letter. If one was ever written, it has not survived, or it has not yet been found, sitting perhaps even now in some private collection or forgotten archive, waiting for the kind of accidental rediscovery that brought the original letter back into the light in the store. What we do know is that within the year the sealed passage in that Pennsylvania mine would be disturbed again. This time, not by company employees acting under careful instruction, but by an outside party, whose arrival in that small town would mark the beginning of a much larger and much stranger chapter in this story, one that involved for the first time people whose job it actually was to understand what lay beneath the hills of Pennsylvania, and whether the chamber those four exhausted miners stumbled into on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon was truly as isolated as everyone initially hoped. The man who arrived in town that following spring did not announce himself as an investigator of any kind, and in fact the surviving accounts suggest he went to some length to appear as something far more mundane, a buyer of mineral samples for an unnamed Eastern collector, the kind of figure who passed through coal towns with some regularity in that period, purchasing unusual rock specimens, fossils, and occasional curiosities from miners willing to sell whatever interesting fragments they happened to pick up during a shift. This cover story, whether it was entirely fabricated or whether it concealed a kernel of genuine legitimate business, allowed him to move through the town and even eventually into the company offices without raising the kind of alarm that an openly declared archaeologist or geologist might have triggered, particularly given how carefully the foreman had been working to keep the previous year's discovery contained. His real name appears with reasonable consistency across the handful of sources that mention him at all, though it is worth noting up front that even this name comes with some uncertainty attached, since at least one local account spells it slightly differently than the version that appears in a brief reference within a regional geological society's later correspondence. For the purposes of this story, we will call him by the name most consistently used, though readers and researchers who go looking for him in the historical record should be prepared for the kind of small, frustrating inconsistencies that tend to accumulate around figures who deliberately avoided leaving a clear paper trail. What drew him to this particular town out of the dozens of similar coal operations scattered across that section of Pennsylvania was almost certainly the letter the foreman had sent the previous year, or some version of information that traced back to it. The antiquarian contact who received that letter appears to have shared its contents directly, or indirectly, with a small network of similarly minded private collectors and amateur researchers who maintained loose correspondence with each other across the eastern United States during this period, exchanging information about unusual finds, the way modern collectors might exchange information today, informally, enthusiastically, and largely outside the awareness of the formal academic institutions that were at the very same time conducting their own, much more public, and much more cautious investigations into the mound builder question. This informal network matters enormously for understanding how a discovery like this could simultaneously generate real interest among people equipped to investigate it and still never make its way into any official record that survives in a form historians today can easily verify. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, busy with its sweeping public survey of the mounds, operated according to careful institutional procedures, requiring documentation, correspondence, and eventually publication that left behind exactly the kind of paper trail that makes modern research possible. The private network of antiquarian collectors operated according to no such procedures at all. Letters were exchanged and sometimes destroyed. Objects were bought, sold, and traded among private hands, with no requirement that anyone record where they had come from or where they eventually ended up. It was in effect a parallel system of knowledge transmission running alongside the official one, faster in some ways, far less reliable in others, and almost entirely invisible to anyone looking back at this period, using only the official archive. The man who arrived in town that spring spent, according to the most detailed surviving account, nearly 2 weeks there before he made any direct approach to the mine itself. He spent that time, by his own later description, in a private letter that does survive in fragmentary form, doing exactly what his cover story suggested, visiting local farms and the homes of several miners known to keep informal collections of interesting rock specimens pulled from the shafts over the years. This was not entirely a pretense. He genuinely did purchase several specimens during this period, and at least 2 of these transactions are documented in the brief personal account books kept by the sellers, which is genuinely tups, and itself a small irony, worth noting, that the most reliable surviving documentation of this man's presence in town comes not from any record of his investigation into the chamber, but from the mundane business records of farmers who sold him a few interesting rocks for a handful of dollars. It was during this period of seemingly casual mineral collecting that he made contact with one of the 4 original miners, not the oldest of the group, but one of the younger men who had been present at the discovery, and who by this point had grown visibly restless with the company's insistence on silence. The exact circumstances of how this contact was initiated remain unclear, whether the investigator sought him out specifically using information from the original letter, or whether the younger miner, frustrated and curious, and perhaps simply needing to talk to someone outside the immediate pressure of the company hierarchy, approached him after recognizing an opportunity to discuss what he had seen with someone who seemed genuinely interested, rather than merely concerned with liability and production schedules. Whatever the initiating circumstance, the conversation that followed produced what is, by a meaningful margin, the most detailed surviving description of the chamber's interior that exists from anyone who was actually present during the original discovery. The investigator, evidently a careful and methodical interviewer, despite his ostensibly casual cover, walked the young miner through his memory of the event multiple times. According to his own later notes, comparing details across retellings to identify which elements remained consistent and which seemed to shift or grow with each new telling. A technique that, whether he had any formal training in it or simply arrived at it through native skepticism, mirrors exactly the kind of careful witness interviewing that modern investigators of any unusual claim are taught to use. What emerged from these conversations, preserved in notes that the investigator apparently kept for his own private reference rather than for any publication he intended to produce, painted a picture of the chamber considerably more detailed than the brief second-hand accounts that had previously circulated. The young miner described with what the investigator's notes characterize as consistent and apparently genuine conviction additional details he had not initially mentioned to the foreman, including the suggestion that the floor of the chamber beneath the loose surface rubble seemed in places to be deliberately leveled, flat in a way that natural cave floors at that depth almost never are, and that along one section of wall, just at the edge of where his lamp had been able to reach during those brief minutes inside, there had what he described. In language, the investigator's notes render with evident care to preserve the man's own words, rather than translate them into more sophisticated terminology, as marks that looked like they had been made on purpose, not by water and not by the blast, but by hands a long time ago, doing something nobody down there understood. This is the detail, more than any single object recovered from the chamber, that seems to have convinced the investigator he had stumbled onto something worth pursuing seriously, beyond what the casual curiosity that had initially brought him to town. Worked stone fragments, however unusual, could in theory be explained away through various conventional means. Items carried in by earlier indigenous visitors to a cave mouth that might have existed near the surface before later collapse sealed it off, or even less plausibly, but not impossibly, objects that had simply washed or shifted into the chamber from elsewhere through some long-forgotten natural process. But deliberate markings on a wall in a chamber that by every account showed no natural opening to the surface at any point in recorded history suggested something considerably harder to break, that someone had been inside that space by some entrance long since closed off and forgotten, and had spent enough time there to leave a mark that survived, apparently undisturbed, until 4 exhausted Pennsylvania coal miners broke through a wall and found it waiting for them, in the dark. Having gathered this much from the young miner, the investigator faced an obvious and difficult problem. The chamber itself remained sealed behind the timber and rubble barrier the foreman, Hollis' crew had erected the previous year. Deep inside an active mind that he had no legitimate reason to enter, and every reason to believe the company would refuse to let him near, especially if his actual interest in the property became known. His notes from this period reveal a man weighing several possible approaches, each with obvious risks, before settling on what turned out to be the simplest, and in retrospect, the most consequential. He approached the foreman directly. This decision deserves some attention, because on its surface, it seems like exactly the kind of move that should have ended his investigation immediately. The foreman had, after all, spent the better part of a year working to keep this discovery quiet, reassigning the original miners and sealing the passage specifically to avoid the attention of outsiders. Why would he suddenly cooperate with a stranger who arrived asking pointed questions about the very thing he had gone to such length to bury, literally and figuratively? The answer, as best as it can be reconstructed from the fragments of correspondence that survive, comes back to that letter the foreman had written the previous year, the one expressing genuine private curiosity about what the objects actually were, and a clear preference for understanding the truth quietly, rather than having it forced into the open, without context. The investigator, it turns out, did not arrive as a stranger making a cold approach. He arrived, carrying by his own account, a letter of introduction from the very antiquarian contact the foreman had originally written to, the man whose identity remains one of this story's more persistent gaps, but whose role as a kind of trusted intermediary becomes clear at exactly this point in the narrative. With that introduction in hand, the foreman's resistance, according to the investigator's own notes, dissolved with what he described as surprising speed, suggesting that the man had been waiting, perhaps for the better part of a year, for exactly this kind of quiet, controlled, unofficial way to learn more about what his men had found, without exposing the company to public scrutiny. The two men met privately, the investigator's notes indicate, on more than one occasion over the following week. And during these meetings, the foreman apparently shared not only the surviving correspondence connected to the discovery, but also eventually agreed to arrange a return visit to the sealed chamber itself, under conditions of strict secrecy, and with a small crew limited to men, the foreman trusted to keep the matter quiet. This return expedition took place, according to the clearest dating available in the surviving notes, in early summer of 1892, just over a year after the original discovery. The crew was small, 4 men beyond the investigator and the foreman himself. including notably the same young miner who had been the investigators' primary source of information, and one other member of the original group of 4. The oldest miner having by this point left the company entirely for reasons the surviving records do not explain, but that at least one later researcher has speculated may have been connected to his own discomfort with what he had seen, a discomfort that several accounts suggest never fully left him in the years that followed. They worked at night after the regular shift had ended, using lanterns rather than the open flame oil lamps the miners typically wore, a choice the investigators' notes attribute to a desire for steadier, more reliable light for what he clearly intended to be a more careful and thorough examination than the brief, frightened visit the original 4 men had managed the previous year. The timber barrier sealing the passage, having sat undisturbed for over a year, came apart with what the notes describe as relative ease, and the narrow passage beyond it, the same smooth-walled corridor the original miners had described, appeared, at least to the investigator's eye, exactly as it had been left, with no sign of any natural collapse or further deterioration in the intervening time. What the investigator recorded upon entering the larger chamber for the first time represents, by a considerable margin, the most detailed and systematic description of the space that exists anywhere in the historical record connected to this story. He measured what he could using a length of marked cord he had brought specifically for this purpose, and arrived at rough dimensions suggesting a chamber roughly 40 feet across, at its widest point, though he was careful to note in his own writing that the irregular shape of the space made any single measurement somewhat misleading, and that the chamber seemed to extend further in, at least 2 directions, than his cord or his lantern light could confirm with any confidence. The ceiling, he noted with evident surprise, was higher than he expected, in places reaching well above where a man could touch, even with his arm fully extended overhead, a detail that mattered, because it meant the space could not be easily explained as simply a low, cramped natural cavity, of the kind that sometimes forms in this type of rock through ordinary water erosion over geological time. The floor matched the young miner's earlier description closely enough that the investigators' notes expressed something close to relief at the confirmation, flat in long sections beneath a thin scattering of loose debris that appeared, upon careful brushing aside, to be largely composed of small fragments of the same worked stone, material the original miners had recovered the previous year, rather than ordinary rockfall debris from the surrounding cave walls. This detail struck the investigator as significant enough to warrant its own extended note, his private record. The observation that an actual natural collapse, of the kind that produces rubble in ordinary caves, would be expected to scatter fragments of the local bedrock, whatever that happened to be in this particular section of the formation, rather than fragments that consistently match the worked, grooved material the men had found the year before. The implication, which the investigator stated plainly in his own words, rather than leaving merely implied, was that whatever structure or surface had originally produced that worked stone material had not simply been carried into the chamber from elsewhere, but had at some point in its history partially collapsed, or been deliberately broken apart within the chamber itself, leaving its own debris scattered across the floor where it had stood. It was while examining this debris field, moving carefully across the chamber floor with his lantern held low, that the investigator and the young miner together located the wall the miner had described from his original visit, the section marked, in his earlier words, by signs that looked like they had been made on purpose. What they found there, illuminated now by steadier and more reliable light than the brief, flickering glimpse the original 4 men had managed, would become, in the years that followed, the single most debated and most consequential detail in this entire story. The piece of evidence that, depending on who you ask among the small community of researchers who have continued to investigate this case across the following century, either proves beyond reasonable doubt that something genuinely extraordinary happened beneath that Pennsylvania hillside, or represents nothing more than an overeager investigator and an impressionable young miner seeing patterns in random natural fracturing that simply was not there. The wall itself, according to the investigator's careful written description, ran for a length he estimated at close to 12 feet, curving slightly inward as it rose, and across a section of it roughly waist height to shoulder height for an average man. The surface had been worked in a way that, in his own words, left him with no comfortable explanation he could offer as a layman. However much he wanted to remain skeptical of his own eyes, the marks were not deep carvings of the kind found in more famous and more thoroughly studied ancient sites elsewhere in the world. They were shallow, almost delicate, a series of grooves and lines that, taken individually, might easily be dismissed as the kind of incidental scratching that occurs naturally where mineral veins meet softer surrounding stone. But taken together, arranged across that 12T span, they formed patterns that repeated, that echoed each other in spacing and depth in a way that pure geological accident, by every account the investigator consulted in the years that followed, should not reliably produce. He described in his notes what appeared to be a series of roughly parallel vertical lines, grouped in clusters of varying numbers, interspersed with curving marks that did not match the vertical groupings in style or apparent technique, suggesting either two different methods of marking the stone or two different sets of marks made at different times, possibly by different hands, possibly separated by an unknown span of years or even generations. Toward one end of the worked section, the marks became denser and more deliberate in their arrangement, clustering into a form that the investigator, in a passage of his notes that has been quoted, paraphrased, and argued over extensively by the handful of later researchers who have had access to it, described as resembling in the crudest and most general sense the outline of a figure. Though he was careful, even in his own private writing, when no audience demanded caution, to qualify this description heavily, noting that he could not be certain whether he was looking at a deliberate representation, or simply allowing his mind, after hours underground in flickering lantern light, to impose a recognizable shape onto an essentially abstract pattern. This kind of careful self-doubt, recorded by a man writing only for his own later reference with no apparent intention of publishing his account for a wider audience, is one of the details that has made this story persist in serious discussion among researchers who specialize in this period rather than being dismissed outright, the way so many similar claims from this era eventually are. People who fabricate discoveries, or who genuinely deceive themselves through excitement and motivated reasoning, tend not to leave behind careful, hedged language questioning their own perceptions. They tend instead toward confident, vivid description, the kind of account that reads well in a sensational newspaper article, but falls apart under careful scrutiny. The investigator's notes do the opposite. They read like the work of a man genuinely trying to be honest about the limits of what he could verify, even when that honesty undercut the more dramatic story he might otherwise have told. Beyond the marked wall itself, the investigator's notes describe locating, in the same general area of the chamber floor, several more worked stone fragments, similar to the one the original miners had recovered the previous year, along with one additional object that does not appear anywhere in the earlier accounts from the original 4 men. A small object that the investigator describes with evident care in choosing his words as resembling a tool, though unlike any tool design he had encountered in his years of casual collecting and dealing in mineral and archaeological specimens. It was, by his measurements, roughly 6 inches in length, made from a material he could not confidently identify by sight alone in the dim lantern light, though he noted that it did not appear to be the same stone as the surrounding chamber walls, suggesting it had been brought into the space rather than fashioned from material found there. The shape, as he described it, narrowed at one end into something resembling a point, though not sharp enough, in his assessment, to function as a weapon or cutting implement in any straightforward sense, while the opposite end widened into a shape his notes compare somewhat awkwardly to the handle of a tool meant to be gripped, though again he qualified this comparison heavily, noting that he had no real expertise in identifying the function of ancient implements, and was offering only his best layman's impression. This object, more than perhaps any other single piece of evidence connected to this entire story, has become the subject of intense and largely unresolved speculation among the researchers who have continued to investigate this case in the decades since. Because, unlike the worked stone fragments, which at least resemble in general terms the kind of carved or shaped stone artifacts found at confirmed indigenous sites elsewhere in North America, this object, by every surviving description, does not closely match any known tool type from any confirmed pre-Columbian culture in the eastern woodlands or anywhere else on Filtstone that researchers have been able to identify with confidence. This single fact, more than any dramatic claim about lost civilizations or impossible technology, is what has kept this story circulating in certain corners of alternative history discussion for well over a century, often in forms considerably more exaggerated and less carefully hedged than the investigators' own original notes ever were. It is worth pausing here to be direct and honest about something that matters enormously for how we understand this entire account. An object not matching any known tool type does not mean the object is necessarily ancient, mysterious, or evidence of some unknown culture. It could just as easily mean the object was poorly described by an untrained observer working in dim light under conditions of genuine fear and excitement. It could mean the object was damaged or partial, missing context that would otherwise make its function obvious. It could even mean, and this possibility deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed, simply because it is less exciting, that the object was never genuinely ancient at all, but was instead something more recent, perhaps even something deliberately placed in that chamber by someone, for reasons we can no longer reconstruct with confidence at this distance in time. The investigator himself, to his credit, raised something close to this last possibility in his own notes, in a passage that reads almost as an argument with himself, weighing the excitement of what he believed he might have found against the discipline of his own self-professed skepticism. He noted that the chamber, while showing no obvious natural opening to the surface in the area the men had explored, had not been fully mapped, and that he could not entirely rule out some unknown access point, perhaps long collapsed or deliberately concealed, through which more recent visitors, whether earlier surveyors, previous miners working other nearby shafts, or even local residents, aware of the ridge folklore discussed earlier in this story, might have entered and left objects of their own, whether as a deliberate hoax, an innocent curiosity, or something in between. This admission, buried in his private notes, and never, as far as any surviving record shows, shared publicly or used to walk back any of his more striking observations, represents exactly the kind of intellectual honesty that makes this case frustrating, in the best possible sense for anyone trying to understand it today. There is no smoking gun here, no single piece of evidence that settles the matter definitively in either direction. What there is instead is a careful, detailed, genuinely puzzled account from a man with real experience handling archaeological material, describing a space and a set of objects that he, himself, could not confidently place into any category he already understood, in a chamber that, by the time he finished his examination that night in the summer of 1892, he was already beginning to suspect extended considerably further than the section his lantern light had managed to reach. That suspicion, recorded almost as an aside near the end of his notes from that first thorough examination, would prove to be the most important observation he made that night, more consequential in the long run than the marked wall or the unidentified tool-like object, because it set in motion everything that happened over the following several weeks. He had noticed while moving along the far edge of the chamber, opposite from where the original blast had broken through, a section of wall where the smooth worked quality of the stone continued past the point where the open chamber space seemed to end, suggesting not a natural boundary, but another passage, similar in character to the one the original miners had walked through, leading further into the hillside rather than simply terminating in solid rock. He did not attempt to explore this second passage that night, for reasons his notes make entirely understandable given the circumstances. The expedition had already run far longer than originally planned. The small crew was exhausted after a full regular shift, followed by hours of careful examination in difficult conditions, and the foreman, increasingly anxious as the night wore on about the practical risk of their absence being noticed by anyone above ground, was pressing for them to conclude the visit and reseal the passage before daylight, made their activity harder to explain. The investigator, by his own account, reluctantly agreed, but not before securing what would prove to be a crucial concession from the foreman, an agreement that they would return, properly equipped this time, with additional lanterns, rope, and enough manpower to explore the second passage safely, rather than simply sealing the entire chamber away again, and hoping the matter would quietly resolve itself. This return expedition took considerably longer to organize than either man initially anticipated, and the surviving correspondence from this period reveals a man growing visibly frustrated with the practical difficulties of arranging a second, more ambitious exploration while maintaining the same level of secrecy that had protected the first. The foreman, for his part, faced increasing pressure from the company's as regional office regarding the shaft's continued underperformance relative to its costs. Pressure that left him with less and less spare time and fewer resources. He could quietly redirect toward an unofficial archaeological investigation that, if discovered by his superiors, could plausibly end his career and the investigators' freedom of movement through company property alike. It was not until early autumn of 1892, several months after that first careful examination, that conditions finally aligned for a second expedition. The crew this time was slightly larger, 6 men beyond the investigator and the foreman, though the surviving notes are careful to specify that this expansion was driven by practical necessity, rather than any loosening of the secrecy that had governed the project from the start, since exploring a previously unmapped passage safely required more hands for rope work and lantern carrying than the original visit had needed. The young miner remained part of the group, now functioning in a role the investigator's notes describe with something approaching genuine respect, less as a simple laborer and more as an informal guide whose familiarity with the chamber from his 2 previous visits made him, in practical terms, the most experienced person present for navigating the space. The second passage, once they reached it, proved narrower than the one leading from the original blast site, narrow enough in places that the men had to proceed single file, with their shoulders brushing both walls, much as the original group had described their first entry the year before. But it was by every account unmistakably similar in character to that first passage, the same smooth workstone surface, the same absence of the rough, irregular texture that would characterize a purely natural formation. The investigator's notes record a growing sense, shared he believed by every man in the group, though none of them said so explicitly at the time, that they were walking through something built rather than simply discovered, a structure whose original purpose and whose builders remained entirely unknown to them, but whose deliberate construction was by this point in the investigation no longer seriously in its base. Doubt among the men present. This second passage ran by the investigator's careful measurement, using the same marked chord technique he had employed in the original chamber for a distance considerably longer than the first, nearly 200 feet, according to his notes. A figure he recorded with evident astonishment, given the engineering effort that distance implied for whoever had originally carved or shaped this corridor through solid rock, using whatever tools and techniques had been available to them. Along the way, the passage was not perfectly straight, curving gently in at least 2 places in a manner that the investigator's notes speculate may have been deliberate, perhaps following some natural fracture or weakness in the surrounding rock that the original builders had used to ease their own excavation work, rather than cutting blindly through solid stone in a perfectly straight line that would have required vastly more effort. At the end of this second passage, the group encountered what the investigator's notes describe in language that grows noticeably more excited and less carefully hedged than his earlier, more cautious descriptions, as a second chamber smaller than the first, but in his assessment considerably more clearly, the product of deliberate construction, rather than natural formation, augmented by human use. The walls of this smaller chamber, his notes record, showed clear evidence of having been shaped into something resembling regular rectangular niches set into the surrounding stone, at intervals, along at least two of the chamber sides. Niches that varied somewhat in size, but that consistently maintained roughly the same proportions, suggesting a standardized purpose rather than the kind of irregular ad hoc modification that might result from simple, ongoing use of a naturally occurring space. It was within several of these niches, according to the most detailed account that survives from this expedition, that the group made the discovery that would ultimately prove to be the most consequential of the entire investigation, more significant in the long run than the worked stone fragments, the marked wall, or even the unidentified tool-like object recovered during the first examination, because what they found resting within those carefully shaped niches, undisturbed by everything that had happened in that hillside over the preceding year, undisturbed, as far as anyone could tell, for a length of time that none of the men present that night were prepared to estimate with any confidence, was not stone, and was not the kind of mineral specimen that any of them, despite their combined years of experience underground, had ever encountered before in their working lives. The investigator's notes described the contents of the first niche he examined closely as a collection of what he initially took in the dim and uncertain lantern light for ordinary bones, the kind of foral remains that sometimes turn up in caves used by animals over long periods, or, occasionally, in rarer and more sobering cases, human remains from burials disturbed by mining or natural processes. But closer examination conducted carefully, and by his own account, with hands that were not entirely steady, given everything the group had already encountered that night, revealed something considerably more puzzling. The objects were bone, or at least appeared to be composed of a material with the general weight, texture, and structure of bone. But they had been shaped deliberately, and with what the investigator's notes describe as evident skill, into forms that did not correspond to any natural anatomical structure he could identify, human or animal. Several of these worked bone objects, his notes record, were tube-shaped, hollow along their length, with a series of small holes drilled at irregular intervals along one side. A description that, when the investigator later shared it in private correspondence with a colleague possessing more formal training than his own casual antiquarian background, drew an immediate and excited comparison to musical instruments, specifically the kind of bone flutes that, though the investigator himself would not have had access to this comparison at the time, given how recently archaeologists were beginning to document such finds elsewhere, modern researchers now recognize as among the oldest known musical instruments crafted by early human populations. Across multiple continents, instruments that when discovered at confirmed prehistoric sites are often dated to many thousands of years in age. This comparison, speculative as it remains, given the limitations of what the investigator himself could verify with the resources available to him in 1892, represents one of the more genuinely startling implications of this entire story. Because if the objects in that Pennsylvania chamber truly were musical instruments, deliberately shaped and drilled by human hands, resting in carefully carved niches within a structure that showed no evidence of any natural surface opening through which more recent visitors might have entered, then the question of who made them and when and why they ended up sealed within a Pennsylvania hillside that would not be touched by any coal mining operation until the very final years of the 19th century becomes considerably more difficult to answer through any conventional historical framework available at the time, or it must be said honestly, through any conventional framework readily available even today. Other niches, according to the investigator's careful room-by-room notation, contained different materials entirely. At least two held what he described as fragments of a dark, fibrous material that crumbled slightly when handled, which he speculated, with appropriate caution, given his lack of formal training in organic material analysis, might represent the remains of woven plant fiber, perhaps once forming a container, or wrapping of some kind, that had largely decomposed over whatever span of time had passed since it was originally placed there, leaving behind only these small, fragile remnants. A third niche, positioned slightly apart from the others, in a section of the chamber wall that, the investigator noted, seemed to have received more careful shaping than its neighbors, contained what proved to be, by his measurements, the single largest object recovered during either expedition, a roughly oval-shaped item, approximately 14 in at its longest point, composed of a material his notes describe with evident frustration at his own inability to properly identify it. Neither stone nor bone, nor any metal he recognized, but something with a smooth, almost glassy surface texture in places, interrupted by patches that felt under his fingers in the dim light, distinctly different, rougher, almost fibrous. This object, more than any other single artifact connected to this story, has become, over the following century, the subject of the most intense and most frustrating speculation among the rest of the relatively small community of researchers who have continued to take this case seriously. Precisely because the investigator's own description, however careful and detailed by the standards of an untrained observer working in extremely difficult conditions, simply does not provide enough information to confidently identify what material the object was actually made, from using the analytical tools and comparative knowledge available either in 1892 or in any rigorous sense today. Given that the object itself does not appear to have survived in any form that modern researchers have been able to locate and examine directly. This absence, this gap between a detailed historical description and the complete unavailability of the actual physical object for modern scientific analysis, sits at the heart of why this entire story occupies such a frustrating position in the broader landscape of American historical mysteries. We have in the investigator's surviving notes what appears by every reasonable measure to be a genuine good-faith, carefully hedged account from a man with real practical experience, handling archaeological material, describing objects and a structure that, if his account is accurate and complete, would represent a discovery of considerable significance to our understanding of pre-Columbian human presence in this specific region of Pennsylvania. But we have no surviving physical evidence that modern carbon dating, material analysis, or any of the sophisticated scientific techniques developed over the following century could apply to settle the matter definitively one way or the other. What we do have, continuing the thread of this story forward from that autumn night in 1892, is the investigator's own account of what happened immediately after this second expedition concluded. An account that becomes, over the following pages of his notes, increasingly focused not on the objects themselves, but on a growing and, in retrospect, well-founded concern about how long this discovery could realistically remain contained within the small circle of people who already knew about it, and what might happen to the chamber, to the objects, and to the men involved once that containment inevitably began to fail. That failure, when it came, did not arrive through any dramatic betrayal or deliberate leak, but through the same ordinary mechanism that undermines almost every attempt at secrecy in a small, close-knit company town, which is simply the impossibility of 6 men working an unusual, secretive night shift, without anyone else eventually noticing and asking questions. The first crack in the containment appeared, according to a brief and somewhat garbled account, preserved in a letter written by a local shopkeeper to a relative in a neighboring county, when one of the 6 men who had participated in the second expedition mentioned, apparently in a moment of exhaustion and reduced caution at the company store some weeks after the fact, that he had seen something underground, that, in his words, as the shopkeeper recorded them second-hand, no church and no school book had ever prepared him to understand this kind of vague, half-formed comment, The sort of thing a tired man might say without fully intending to reveal anything specific is exactly the kind of seed from which small-town rumor tends to grow with remarkable speed. And grow it did. Within a matter of weeks, according to several surviving local accounts collected decades later by the same regional folklorist who had documented the earlier Ridge legends, a version of the story was circulating through the town that bore only a loose resemblance to what the investigators' careful notes actually describe. A version involving, depending on who was telling it, everything from buried treasure to bones of giants to, in one particularly elaborate retelling that the folklorist's notes preserve with evident amusement, an entire underground city populated by the descendants of some ancient lost people who, in this version of the story, were said to still be living down there, undiscovered, watching the miners work above them. This is, of course, exactly the kind of exaggeration that tends to attach itself to any genuine mystery once it passes beyond the control of the small number of people who actually witnessed the original events. And it represents one of the most significant obstacles facing anyone today who tries to separate what actually happened in that Pennsylvania mine from what later folklore, embellishment, and outright invention added to the story over the following decades. The investigator himself, according to a frustrated entry in his notes dated to this period, recognized this danger clearly and immediately, writing that he feared the genuine significance of what they had found would be buried, not beneath rock this time, but beneath layers of exaggeration and disbelief that would make it impossible for any serious person to take the matter seriously. Once the wilder versions of the story began circulating widely enough to reach the ears of people who might otherwise have been inclined to investigate properly, his fear proved well-founded, though not in quite the way he initially anticipated. The exaggerated rumors circulating through the town did not, as it turned out, immediately attract the kind of serious outside scientific attention that might have settled the matter, one way or the other, through proper investigation. What they attracted instead, within a matter of months, was something considerably more mundane, and for the company's purposes, considerably more dangerous, which was the attention of a regional newspaper editor who had built something of a reputation and a readership on stories of exactly this flavor, tales of buried treasure, ancient mysteries, and the kind of sensational unexplained phenomena that sold papers reliably in an era before radio, film, or any of the later media that would eventually take over that particular cultural function. The editor, whose newspaper served several of the smaller coal towns scattered across that section of the county, dispatched a young reporter to the town with explicit instructions, preserved in a brief surviving note from the editor's own papers, to find out what these miners are saying about the thing in the ground, and write it up, regardless of whether it can be confirmed. Because the readers, he wrote with characteristic bluntness, do not care whether it is confirmed, they care whether it is interesting. This instruction, blunt and cynical as it sounds, captures something important about how stories like this one tend to enter the broader public record in this era, not through careful, methodical scientific investigation, but through the considerably less reliable filter of commercial journalism, operating under explicit instructions to prioritize entertainment value over verification. The reporter who arrived in town that winter spent, by his own later published account, several days interviewing local residents, though notably, according to the surviving company records from this period, he was never granted any access to the mine itself, the company having by this point grown sufficiently alarmed by the spreading rumors to tighten security around the site considerably beyond what had been necessary during the original investigators' quieter, more careful visits the previous year. Denied direct access to the source of the story, the reporter did what journalists under the deadline pressure in this position have done throughout the history of the profession, which is to construct his article primarily from second-hand accounts, local rumor, and whatever fragments of the wilder folklore version of the story he could collect from residents willing to talk, producing a piece that, when it finally appeared in print in early 1893, bore even less resemblance to the investigators' careful original notes than the local rumors themselves had. The published article, a copy of which survives in at least one regional newspaper archive, and has been examined by several of the researchers who have looked into this case over the following decades, described in suitably dramatic prose for its intended audience. An underground temple of an ancient and forgotten race, complete with treasure chambers, and what the article's anonymous author, almost certainly the reporter working from second-hand rumor rather than any direct knowledge, characterized as evidence of human sacrifice, a detail that appears nowhere in the investigator's actual surviving notes. And that, as far as any serious researcher who has examined this case since has been able to determine, has no basis whatsoever in anything the original miners or the investigator himself ever reported. This single article, sensational and largely fabricated, as its more dramatic elements clearly were, would go on to cause this entire story significantly more damage to its credibility than any deliberate company cover-up ever managed, because it gave the entire affair, in the eyes of any serious scientist or historian who might later have encountered it, the unmistakable flavor of exactly the kind of fabricated, sensationalized treasure story that filled the pages of regional newspapers throughout this period, with no basis in genuine fact whatsoever. It is one of the more bitter ironies running through this entire account that the company's careful, controlled attempt to manage the discovery quietly, motivated as it was by entirely mundane business concerns about production schedules and outside interference, may have inadvertently protected the credibility of what the original investigator actually documented, simply by preventing direct access that would have allowed a journalist to either confirm or properly debunk the wilder rumors that were already circulating by the time his article was written. Instead, the story split almost from this point forward into two entirely separate threads: the careful, hedged, frustratingly incomplete account, preserved in the investigator's private notes, largely unknown to the wider public for decades afterward, and the increasingly exaggerated, increasingly unreliable folk version that spread through newspapers, local storytelling, and eventually, much later, the earliest forms of what we would now recognize as alternative history publishing, a version of the story that bore the same basic shape as what actually happened, but that grew with every retelling further and further from whatever could be verified. The newspaper article itself, once it appeared in print, produced exactly the reaction within the coal company's regional offices that anyone familiar with the cautious, profit-focused culture of these operations might have predicted. The company's senior management, according to a series of internal memos that survive in fragmentary form within the same collection that preserved the foreman's original letter, reacted with what can only be described as genuine alarm. Not because they believed the more sensational claims about underground temples and human sacrifice, which the surviving memos treat with the kind of dismissive contempt one would expect from hard-headed businessmen accustomed to dealing in tonnage and freight rates, rather than archaeological mystery, but because the publicity itself, regardless of its accuracy, threatened to bring exactly the kind of outside attention and operational disruption the foreman had been working to avoid from the very beginning. The response, when it came, was swift and considerably more thorough than the original sealing effort the year before. Within weeks of the article's publication, according to company records, that unusually for this period survive in relatively complete form, precisely because this particular decision generated enough internal correspondence and budget approval paperwork to leave a clear paper trail. The company authorized a full and permanent sealing of the entire section of the mine, containing both chambers, not with the temporary timber barrier that had been used previously, but with a substantial poured concrete and masonry wall, an expense significant enough that it required direct approval from the company's board, a level of authorization far beyond anything the foreman alone could have previously commanded. The official justification recorded in these surviving documents cites concerns about structural instability in that section of the shaft, language that, taken at face value, sounds like a reasonable and mundane safety decision of exactly the kind mining companies made regularly throughout this period, when sections of a mine proved geologically unstable or simply not worth the continued investment relative to their coal yield. And it is entirely possible, even likely, that this justification was not purely a cover story, but reflected genuine concerns, since the chambers and passages described throughout this story were, after all, unsurveyed, ancient excavations of unknown structural integrity sitting beneath an active industrial mining operation, a combination that any responsible mine operator would have legitimate safety reasons to want permanently and securely closed off, regardless of any archaeological significance. This is again one of the recurring difficulties that makes this entire case so frustrating to Tom. Evaluate with any real confidence from this distance in time. The company's actions throughout this story, from the original temporary sealing to this final, much more permanent closure, are consistent with both a genuine mundane concern for operational safety and liability and a deliberate effort to bury quite literally an inconvenient discovery before it could generate further scrutiny. The surviving documentary record does not clearly distinguish between these two motivations, and it is entirely possible that both were operating simultaneously in the minds of the men making these decisions, since human institutions rarely act from a single clean motivation when multiple overlapping concerns happen to point toward the same convenient conclusion. What we do know, with somewhat greater confidence, based on the surviving correspondence between the investigator and his antiquarian contact during this period, is that the investigator himself was given no advanced warning of the permanent sealing decision, and that learned of it by his own account in a letter dated several weeks after the fact, only after the work had already been completed. This detail matters considerably for understanding the final shape this story would take, because it means that whatever additional examination the investigator might have hoped to conduct, whatever additional objects he might have hoped to recover or document more thoroughly given more time, was foreclosed entirely and without warning, leaving his notes from the two expeditions in 1892, as to the best of any researcher's knowledge who has examined this case in the decades since, the only detailed first-hand documentation of the chamber's interior that exists anywhere in any form, public or private. The letter in which the investigator describes learning of the permanent sealing carries a tone notably different from the careful, measured prose that characterizes most of his other surviving writing connected to this case. It is, by the standards of his usual restraint, genuinely bitter, expressing frustration not merely at losing access to a site he clearly believed held considerable additional significance, but at what he characterized in language that has been quoted with some regularity by later researchers sympathetic to his account, as a kind of willful blindness on the part of institutions more interested in coal tonnage than in understanding what might be the single most significant archaeological discovery made in that entire region of Pennsylvania. In living memory sealed away again, he wrote before anyone with the proper training and resources had been given a real chance to study it. This frustration, whatever its ultimate justification, did not translate into any successful effort on the investigator's part to bring the matter to wider scientific attention through more official channels. His attempts to do so, documented in at least two further letters that survived from the following year, addressed to figures connected with the very same Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology survey that was at that exact moment conducting its sweeping and far more methodologically rigorous investigation into the mound builder question across the broader region, met with responses that, while not openly dismissive, were notably cautious and non-committal, requesting additional documentation, physical specimens, or direct site access that the investigator, given the company's permanent sealing of the chamber and his own complicated semi-clandestine relationship with the mine's ownership, was simply unable to provide. This response from the official scientific establishment of the period, frustrating as it clearly was for the investigator, reflects something important and worth understanding honestly about how institutional science actually operated during this era, and in many ways continues to operate today. A private collector's second-hand account of an inaccessible site, however detailed and however carefully hedged in its claims, simply does not carry the same evidentiary weight as a properly documented excavation, conducted under controlled, repeatable scientific conditions. And the researchers at institutions like the Smithsonian, already managing an enormous and contentious public debate over the mound builder question that required exactly this kind of careful, defensible methodology to settle credibly, had little institutional appetite for chasing down an unverifiable claim from an amateur collector about a site that had by that point already been sealed away and was no longer accessible for independent verification, regardless of how the matter was ultimately resolved. With the official channels closed and the chamber itself sealed permanently beneath fresh concrete, the story might easily have ended there entirely, fading into exactly the kind of forgotten regional curiosity that local historians sometimes encounter buried in old county records. A single strange paragraph with no clear resolution, that it did not end quite so cleanly, owes something to the subsequent lives of the men who had actually been present for the original discovery, particularly the miner at the very center of this story, whose own path over the following years adds a final, genuinely unsettling layer to everything that came before. He remained with the company for several more years after the discovery, according to the surviving payroll records, working in sections of the mine well away from the area that had been permanently sealed. And by every account that survives from people who knew him during this period, he said remarkably little about what he had seen, certainly far less than the spreading town rumors might have suggested for a man who had supposedly witnessed an underground temple populated by the descendants of an ancient lost people. This relative silence is itself worth noting, because it stands in some contrast to the behavior of the younger miner who had become the investigator's primary source, suggesting that whatever the original discoverer experienced in that chamber affected him in a manner considerably more private and internal than the eager, talkative engagement that characterized his younger colleagues' later involvement with the investigation. What we do have preserved through an unusual and somewhat circuitous path is a brief account the miner apparently gave very late in his life to a grandchild who would go on to share it decades later with the same regional folklorist who collected so much of the other material woven through this story. This account, second-hand and filtered through both the passage of many decades and the natural softening and reshaping that family stories undergo as they pass between generations, nonetheless contains several details that align closely enough with the investigator's own contemporary notes to suggest a genuine continuity of memory, rather than simple invention or contamination from the more sensational newspaper version of events that had by that point been circulating for the better part of the man's adult life. According to this account, the miner described the moment of breaking through into the original passage, not primarily in terms of fear, which is how most retellings of this story, including the version preserved in this very documentary, naturally tend to emphasize the experience given the inherent drama of discovering an unknown ancient space, deep, underground. Instead, he apparently described, in the words his grandchild later recorded as faithfully as memory allowed, a feeling closer to recognition, an unsettling sense, as he put it, according to this account, that he had walked into somewhere he was not supposed to find, but that had, in some way he could never properly articulate, even to himself across the following decades, been waiting for exactly this kind of accidental discovery. This detail, however much weight any careful researcher should reasonably assign to a deathbed reminiscence filtered through multiple generations of retelling, has nonetheless become one of the most frequently quoted elements of this story within the community of researchers and enthusiasts who have kept this case alive in the decades since, precisely because it captures something that the more sensational newspaper version of the story with its temples and treasure and human sacrifice entirely fails to convey, which is the genuinely strange, ambiguous, unresolved quality of the actual lived experience, as described by the one person who was there from the very first moment. A man who by every account spent the rest of his long life carrying something he never fully processed and never fully shared. Not out of secrecy exactly, but out of what his grandchild's account suggests was simply an inability to find adequate words for an experience that did not fit neatly into any framework. Available to a working coal miner in rural Pennsylvania at the close of the 19th century. The miner died, according to the genealogical records that have allowed later researchers to trace this part of the story with reasonable confidence, in the early decades of the 20th century, having lived long enough to see significant changes in the mining industry that had defined his entire working life, but having apparently never returned to the section of the mine where the discovery occurred, even after that section was decades later, and for reasons connected to the broader decline of anthrate mining across the region, rather than any renewed archaeological interest, finally abandoned entirely as the company that had once owned it ceased operations, and the shaft itself was allowed to flood and collapse in the gradual, unceremonious way that so many of the deep anthrate mines across this part of Pennsylvania eventually did, once the coal that had justified their existence finally ran too thin and too expensive to extract profitably. This final detail, the eventual flooding and collapse of the original shaft, matters enormously for understanding why this story occupies such a frustrating position for anyone today who wants to investigate it properly using modern methods. The chamber, if it survives at all in any recognizable form after more than a century of underground water intrusion, and the gradual structural collapse that affects abandoned mine workings throughout this region, sits somewhere beneath ground. That is by most accounts from local mining historians and the handful of researchers who have attempted to locate the precise site using surviving company maps, no longer safely accessible. Through any of the original mine workings, which have long since flooded and partially collapsed in the decades since the operation ceased. Any modern attempt to verify this story through direct physical investigation would require, at minimum, the kind of resources, permissions, and specialized mine rescue and archaeological expertise that no individual researcher, and as far as any public record, indicates no institution has yet committed to the project. This is in the end where the verifiable historical thread of this story largely runs out, leaving behind a frustrating but genuinely fascinating collection of partial evidence, an investigator's careful and apparently honest private notes, a handful of surviving letters and company records that corroborate the broad outline of events, even while leaving crucial details unconfirmed, a sensationalized and largely unreliable newspaper account that did real damage to the story's credibility, while paradoxically helping to keep some version of it alive in public memory across the following century, and a body of local folklore collected decades after the fact that preserves fragments of genuine memory tangled together with the kind of embellishment and exaggeration that inevitably accumulates around any story, this strange, this old, and this thoroughly unresolved. But to understand why this particular story has continued to resurface every few decades, in old newspaper clippings rediscovered by genealogists, in regional historical society newsletters, and now in the kind of long-form video essay you are listening to tonight, it helps to step back, even further from this single Pennsylvania mine, and look at the broader pattern this discovery fits into. A pattern that once you start looking for it, appears with surprising frequency throughout the buried half-acknowledged history of pre-Columbian North America. This was after all not an isolated incident in the broader sweep of American industrial history. The same decades that saw coal companies pushing ever deeper shafts into the hills of Pennsylvania also saw railroad crews blasting through mountain passes across the continent, canal diggers cutting new waterways through previously undisturbed ground, and farmers across the Midwest plowing fields that had sat largely untouched since long before European Kagan. Each of these activities, conducted at a scale and pace that the 19th century had never previously attempted occasionally and unavoidably broke into ground that held evidence of much older human activity. Evidence that the rapidly industrializing nation of that era was by and large simply not equipped institutionally or culturally to properly recognize, document, or preserve. The pattern that emerges from looking at dozens of these scattered incidents together rather than any single case in isolation is consistent and in its own way quietly damning of how thoroughly 19th century America prioritized economic expansion over historical preservation. Railroad workers cutting through a ridge in West Virginia reportedly broke into a chamber containing unusual skeletal remains that were measured, briefly described in a local paper, and then lost entirely. The remains themselves apparently discarded or sold to private collectors whose holdings have never been traced. While diggers in Ohio struck what was described in another brief regional newspaper account from this same general period as a stone shaft extending well below any depth that conventional, indigenous well-digging techniques known to researchers at the time were thought to reach, a discovery that generated a flurry of brief local interest before the well was simply completed and put into ordinary use, the strange shaft beneath it sealed away and functionally forgotten. These scattered incidents, taken individually, each suffer from exactly the same evidentiary problems that plague the Pennsylvania case at the center of this story. Second-hand and third-hand accounts, missing physical evidence, sensationalized newspaper coverage that makes careful verification difficult, and a complete absence of the kind of careful, repeatable, institutionally documented investigation that modern archaeology requires before it will treat any claim as established fact. But taken together as a pattern repeating across multiple states, multiple decades, and multiple entirely unconnected industries, all driven by the same underlying force of rapid, careless industrial expansion tearing into ground that had never been properly surveyed for what it might contain. They paint a picture that deserves more serious consideration than any single incident alone could support. A picture of a continent whose pre-Columbian human history was by the time serious, professional archaeology finally developed the tools and institutional commitment to study it properly in the 20th century, already substantially damaged, scattered, and in many specific local cases, permanently lost. This broader pattern connects directly back to the mound builder controversy discussed earlier in this story, and it is worth taking a moment now to go deeper into that controversy than the brief summary offered previously, because understanding exactly how wrong 19th century Americans were about the scale and sophistication of pre-Columbian civilization in North America helps explain why a discovery like the one beneath that Pennsylvania hillside could be simultaneously so significant and so easily dismissed or distorted by the people who encountered it. The earthworks scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, structures like the Great Serpent Mound in Ohio, stretching for over a quarter-mile in a sinuous, deliberately serpentine shape across a ridge overlooking a local creek, or the enormous, geometrically precise earthwork complexes at sites like Newark, Ohio, which include circular and octagonal enclosures large enough to contain multiple modern football fields within their walls, represent by the careful measurement and analysis that 20th and 21st century archaeology has finally been able to apply to them. Engineering and organizational achievements that required exactly the kind of large-scale, coordinated labor, astronomical knowledge, and long-term planning that 19th century Americans, for reasons deeply entangled with the racial and political ideologies of their era, simply refused to believe indigenous peoples were capable of producing. The Newark earthworks, specifically, to take one well-documented example that illustrates this point with particular clarity, have been shown through careful modern surveying to incorporate precise astronomical alignments connected to the complex 18 6-year cycle of the moon's rising and setting positions along the horizon, a cycle so subtle and so extended that identifying and then physically encoding it into a permanent earthwork would have required generations of careful, continuous astronomical observation passed down through a sophisticated and stable knowledge tradition. The kind of achievement that when European observers encountered comparable monuments like Stonehenge in England was celebrated as proof of remarkable ancient sophistication, but that when applied to monuments built by indigenous Americans was instead used as evidence that some other vanished, presumably more advanced race must have been responsible because the actual builders, as far as 19th-century observers were concerned, simply could not be credited with such achievement. This is the broader intellectual and cultural context into which the Pennsylvania discovery emerged in 1891, a context where the actual scale of pre-Columbian achievement in North America was being simultaneously documented with increasing rigor by serious researchers and actively obscured by a popular culture and a political establishment that had every motivation to minimize indigenous achievement. In an era when the same nation was actively engaged in displacing and suppressing the very peoples whose ancestors had built these monuments, a genuinely significant archaeological discovery made by working coal miners with no formal training and investigated by an amateur antiquarian operating largely outside official channels, stood almost no realistic chance of receiving the kind of careful, well-funded, institutionally supported attention that might have settled its significance definitively, not because the discovery itself necessarily lacked merit, but because the surrounding, cultural and institutional apparatus of the era was simply not built to properly process a finding of this kind, regardless of its actual historical importance. Given everything we have just walked through, it is worth pausing now to consider carefully and, without rushing toward any single satisfying answer, the range of explanations that serious researchers who have examined this case over the following century have proposed for what that chamber beneath the Pennsylvania hillside might actually have been, because the honest answer is that no single theory fits every detail in the surviving record comfortably, and the genuine uncertainty that runs through this entire story is in its own way more interesting and more worth sitting with than any tidy resolution would be. The most straightforward explanation, and the one that most professional archaeologists who have been informally consulted about cases like this over the years tend to favor as a starting point, holds that the chamber represented a previously undocumented indigenous ceremonial or burial site constructed by ancestors of the historic tribes who inhabited this region of Pennsylvania before European contact, specifically groups connected to the broader Susquehannock and related Iroquoian-speaking peoples who are well documented as having occupied this section of the state in the centuries immediately preceding sustained European settlement, along with earlier, less well-documented populations, whose presence in this specific region extends back considerably further into the same general cultural traditions, sometimes grouped under the broader label of woodland period, peoples that produce the mound complexes discussed earlier in this story. This explanation fits comfortably with several of the most well-corroborated details in the investigators' notes. The worked stone fragments, the apparent musical instruments fashioned from bone, the deliberate, careful construction of the passages and chambers themselves, all of which align reasonably well with archaeological evidence recovered from confirmed indigenous sites elsewhere in the eastern woodlands, sites that have, unlike this Pennsylvania chamber, been properly excavated, documented, and preserved using modern professional methods, providing exactly the kind of comparative context that allows researchers to evaluate how plausible this explanation really is. Under this theory, what made the Pennsylvania chamber unusual was not that it represented some impossible or unexplainable phenomenon, but simply that it happened to be located at a depth and in a configuration likely accessed originally through a now collapsed or deliberately concealed surface entrance that placed it well below where conventional industrial mining would normally be expected to encounter such a site. creating the dramatic and disorienting impression of a structure existing impossibly deep underground, when in fact, it may have originally been a surface or near-surface structure that had simply been buried by geological processes, landslides, or deliberate concealment over the centuries since its original construction and use. This explanation, reasonable and well-grounded as it is, does leave certain details in the investigators' account somewhat uncomfortably unresolved, particularly the unidentified tool-like object recovered during the first expedition, which, as discussed earlier in this story, does not closely match any confirmed indigenous tool type from this region that researchers have been able to identify, and the large oval object of uncertain material recovered from the deeper chambers niches, which similarly resists confident identification using any comparative framework currently available. Proponents of the straightforward indigenous ceremonial site explanation generally respond to these gaps by pointing out reasonably enough that the historical and archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America remains genuinely incomplete, that countless tool types, materials, and cultural practices from this period have simply never been documented, because the relevant sites were destroyed, looted, or lost before professional archaeology developed the resources and institutional commitment to study them properly, and that an unidentified object from an undocumented site is not by itself strong evidence of anything more exotic than the simple fact that our knowledge of pre-Columbian material culture remains far less complete than popular understanding typically assumes. A second explanation, considerably more speculative, but taken seriously by a smaller subset of researchers who have examined this case, particularly those working within the broader tradition of investigating what is sometimes called America's forbidden or suppressed archaeology, proposes that the chamber may represent evidence of a considerably older human presence in this region than the conventional archaeological timeline for the eastern woodlands currently allows, potentially connected to broader and still genuinely unresolved questions within mainstream archaeology about exactly when and how the Americas were first populated by humans migrating from elsewhere on the planet. This is a genuinely active and legitimate area of ongoing scientific debate worth taking seriously on its own merits, regardless of how it might or might not connect to the Pennsylvania case specifically. The conventional model that dominated American archaeology for most of the 20th century, often called the Clovis First model, after the distinctive stone tool technology associated with some of the earliest confidently dated human sites in North America, held that humans first entered the continent via a land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska sometime around 13,000 years ago, spreading rapidly southward and eastward from there. This model has been seriously challenged over the past several decades by a growing body of archaeological evidence from sites across both North and South America, suggesting considerably earlier human presence, in some cases potentially extending back 20,000 years or more. Evidence that has forced even mainstream conservative archaeological institutions to substantially revise their understanding of the early peopling of the Americas. A revision that remains actively ongoing and genuinely contentious within professional archaeological circles even today. If a chamber like the one described in this story did contain evidence connected to this older, still poorly understood period of American prehistory, the unusual and unidentified character of certain objects described in the investigators' notes becomes somewhat more explicable, not because it requires any fantastical or supernatural explanation, but simply because we would be dealing with material culture from a period of American history, so early and so poorly documented through confirmed archaeological sites, that almost any object recovered from it might reasonably fail to match the comparative frameworks researchers have built primarily around the much better documented woodland and later periods discussed earlier in this story. It is important, in fairness to the genuine uncertainty this case deserves, to state plainly that this second explanation remains considerably more speculative than the first, and that no responsible researcher who has examined the surviving record connected to this Pennsylvania discovery, would claim it definitively supports an extremely early peopling timeline over the simpler, better supported explanation of a more conventional, if still undocumented, indigenous ceremonial site from a later period. The honest position, the one that the investigator himself seemed to arrive at in his own more careful and self-doubting moments, is that the surviving evidence, fragmentary and unverifiable as it is, simply does not allow for a confident resolution between these competing explanations, and that anyone presenting this story as definitive proof of either possibility is overstating what the historical record can actually support. There is inevitably a third category of explanation that has attached itself to this story over the decades, particularly within the corners of alternative history discussion that grew up around the more sensationalized newspaper version of events, rather than the investigator's own careful restrained notes. And intellectual honesty requires that we address this category directly, rather than simply ignoring it, even though it deserves considerably more skepticism than the two explanations already discussed. This third category encompasses a range of claims popularized initially through that 1893 newspaper article and elaborated considerably further in later decades by various self-published writers and eventually internet forums and early alternative history publications, suggesting that the Pennsylvania Chamber represented evidence not merely of an early but still recognizably human pre-Columbian presence, but of something considerably more exotic, variously described across different versions of this elaborated story as evidence of a lost, technologically advanced civilization, predating and unconnected to any known indigenous culture, or in the most extreme versions that occasionally surface in the wilder fringes of online discussion, evidence connected to broader claims about ancient non-human or extraterrestrial influence on early American prehistory. These claims, it must be stated plainly and without excessive hedging, have no credible support in the actual surviving historical record connected to this case. The investigator's own careful notes, which represent by far the most detailed and most carefully documented first-hand account of the chamber's actual contents, describe objects and structures that, while genuinely puzzling and not always confidently identifiable, fall well within the range of what a careful, honest researcher with limited formal training might reasonably describe when encountering an unfamiliar but fundamentally human-made archaeological site. Nothing in the surviving record describes technology, materials, or construction techniques that exceed what we know human societies, including pre-Columbian indigenous societies across the Americas, were genuinely capable of producing using period-appropriate tools and accumulated traditional knowledge. The more exotic claims that have attached themselves to this story over the decades represent, almost entirely later embellishment, building on the sensationalized 1893 newspaper account rather than anything traceable back to the original, more careful documentation. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it illustrates something important about how stories like this one tend to evolve once they enter wider public circulation, particularly in the era of internet discussion forums and video content, where this kind of historical mystery now finds much of its audience. The genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain core of this story, an unusual archaeological discovery made under difficult conditions by untrained observers, investigated informally by a careful but amateur antiquarian, and ultimately sealed away before proper scientific documentation could occur, gets progressively replaced with each retelling across each new medium by a version optimized not for accuracy but for maximum dramatic impact, because that is simply what spreads most effectively through whatever communication channel happens to be carrying the story at any given moment. The 1893 newspaper needed to sell copies to readers who, as its editor bluntly acknowledged in his own surviving correspondence, cared more about being entertained than about being accurately informed. The later alternative history writers who picked up the story needed content dramatic enough to sustain reader interest across an entire book or article. And inevitably, content created for platforms like this one face some version of the same pressure, which is exactly why it matters, in telling this story honestly, to keep returning as we have throughout. Start this account to what the most careful and most contemporaneous surviving documentation actually says, rather than simply repeating the most exciting version that has accumulated the most attention over the intervening century. Having said all of this, it would be equally dishonest to pretend that the genuine, well-documented uncertainty at the core of this story is somehow less interesting or less worth our attention than the exaggerated versions that have grown up around it. A real archaeological discovery made under genuinely difficult and disorienting conditions, investigated by a man whose own private notes show him wrestling honestly with the limits of his own perception and expertise, and ultimately sealed away by a company more concerned with coal tonnage than historical preservation before any properly trained researcher had the opportunity to study it, using the rigorous methods that might have settled its significance definitively, is a genuinely remarkable and genuinely frustrating story, entirely on its own merits, without needing any embellishment about lost civilizations or impossible technology to make it worth telling. This brings us to the more recent chapter of this story, the efforts that a small handful of researchers, historians, and dedicated amateur investigators have made over the past several decades to determine, using whatever modern resources and techniques are available to them, exactly what can still be verified about this case, and whether anything resembling the original chamber might still exist in any accessible or studyable form beneath that Pennsylvania hillside today. The most serious and sustained of these modern investigative efforts was undertaken, according to the published results of his work that appear in a regional historical journal, with a relatively small but dedicated readership focused on Pennsylvania coal country, history by an independent historian who spent the better part of a decade, beginning in the early 2000s, attempting to reconstruct the precise location and current physical condition of the original mine shaft, using a combination of surviving company maps, period geological surveys, and modern mine substance records maintained by Pennsylvania's State Environmental Protection Agency, which tracks abandoned mine workings across the state precisely because of the ongoing safety hazards. These collapsed and flooded shafts continue to pose to surface structures and infrastructure built above them in the decades since active mining ceased. His research careful and methodical in a way that mirrors in its own modern context the same careful approach the original 1892 investigator brought to his own work over a century earlier succeeded in narrowing down the likely location of the original shaft to a specific, relatively small area. Though he was careful in his published findings to note that the surviving maps from this period are themselves not always perfectly reliable, having been produced under the same kind of time and budget pressure that characterized the original mining operation, and that any precise location he proposed should be understood as a reasonable best estimate, rather than a definitive identification. What this modern research was able to establish with somewhat greater confidence, drawing on the state's mine subsidence and water monitoring records, is that the general area where the shaft once operated has consistent with the pattern affecting abandoned anthroit workings across this entire region of Pennsylvania experienced significant groundwater flooding in the decades since mining operations ceased, with state monitoring data indicating water levels in the connected network of abandoned underground workings in this one specific area, rising to a point that would, by any reasonable estimate, place the depth at which the original chamber was discovered well below the current water table. This finding, while not entirely surprising given what we already know about how abandoned anthroit mines throughout this region typically behave once active pumping operations stop and groundwater is allowed to return to its natural level, carries significant and somewhat discouraging implications for the practical possibility of any future direct investigation of the original chamber, since accessing a flooded underground space at significant depth requires specialized techniques, equipment, and safety protocols that go considerably beyond what any individual researcher, however dedicated, could reasonably undertake without substantial institutional support and funding that, as far as any available public record indicates, has never been secured for this specific case. The same researcher did make one further discovery during his investigation, that while not resolving the central mystery of this story, adds a genuinely interesting additional layer to the historical record connected to it. While searching through the surviving records of the Regional Historical Society that had, decades earlier, collected the folklore accounts referenced throughout this story, he located a previously uncatalogued box of materials that had apparently been donated to the Society sometime in the 1970s by a descendant of the original antiquarian investigator, materials that had sat largely unexamined in the Society's collection for several decades, simply because no staff member or volunteer had ever had the specific knowledge needed to recognize their connection to this particular Pennsylvania case. This box contained, according to the researcher's published account of his findings, several additional pages of the investigator's notes that had not previously been known to exist in any form. Pages that appear to represent a kind of summary or reflection written some years after the events described throughout this story, likely composed sometime in the early years of the 20th century, based on internal references to other events that can be dated with reasonable confidence. These additional pages do not frustratingly provide any dramatic new revelation that resolves the central uncertainties this story has wrestled with throughout, but they do offer a genuinely moving final glimpse into how the investigator himself came with the benefit of years of additional reflection to understand what he believed he had witnessed. In these later pages, the investigator writes with what the modern researcher who discovered them characterized as a tone of resigned acceptance, rather than the more excited, actively investigating voice that characterizes his original 1,892 notes. He acknowledges in language that the modern researcher quotes directly in his published findings that he never succeeded in obtaining the kind of expert confirmation he had originally hoped for, that his attempts to interest proper scientific institutions in the discovery had come to nothing, and that the permanent sealing of the chamber had, in his own words, settled the matter, as far as the world at large would ever be concerned, regardless of what he personally continued to believe about its significance. But he also writes in a passage that has understandably become one of the most frequently quoted elements of this entire story among the small community of researchers who take it seriously, that he did not regret the time and effort he had invested in the investigation, because in his own words as preserved in this later document, he had been permitted to see something that very few men of his era would ever have the opportunity to witness, a glimpse, however brief and however poorly understood, into a depth of American history that the country surrounding him seemed entirely uninterested in acknowledging, preoccupied as it was in his characterization with railroads and factories and the endless pursuit of the kind of progress that left no room for curiosity about what had come before, buried and forgotten beneath the very ground that progress was being built upon. This sentiment, expressed by a man writing in quiet retrospect, more than a decade after the events that had briefly consumed his attention and his curiosity, captures something that runs through this entire story and through countless similar scattered cases from across this same general period of rapid, careless American industrial expansion. The investigator was, in his own modest and largely unrecognized way, attempting to practice something close to genuine historical and archaeological inquiry, decades before the institutional infrastructure, funding and professional training that would eventually make rigorous archaeology possible across the broader landscape of American prehistory had fully developed. He simply lacked the resources, the institutional support, and ultimately, the access that proper investigation would have required, and the chamber he so carefully documented, whatever it actually represented, was sealed away before any of those missing pieces could be supplied. It is worth sitting for a moment with the genuine sadness embedded in that outcome, separate entirely from any question of whether the chamber contained evidence of extremely ancient, human presence, more conventional indigenous ceremonial activity, or something in between, that we simply do not have enough information to classify with confidence. A man spent real time and real personal resources trying to understand something significant that he had stumbled into, working largely alone against institutional indifference and active commercial pressure to simply forget what he had seen. And in the end, the world he was trying to inform about his discovery simply moved on without him, more interested, as he himself observed with evident bitterness in his own final reflections, in the coal that could be extracted from that hillside, than in whatever older human story might have been buried alongside it. If you have found yourself drawn into this story tonight, drifting along with the slow unfolding of one man, as strange experience beneath a Pennsylvania hillside, it is worth taking some time now to widen our view once more and consider how this single case connects to a much larger, much stranger thread that runs throughout the buried history of the American landscape. A thread that researchers who specialize in what is sometimes called forbidden or suppressed American archaeology have spent decades trying to trace with results that remain, much like the case at the center of this story, frustratingly incomplete, but genuinely compelling when considered together rather than in isolation. Consider for a moment the case of the so-called giant skeletons, a category of historical claim that appears with startling and genuinely puzzling regularity, scattered across regional, newspaper archives throughout the entire 19th century, in states ranging from Ohio and Indiana through Tennessee and well into the broader Mississippi Valley region. These accounts individually suffer from precisely the same evidentiary weaknesses that plague the Pennsylvania case we have spent this evening exploring: second-hand and third-hand reporting, missing physical remains, the near-total absence of any specimen that survived long enough to be examined using modern forensic and archaeological techniques. Mainstream archaeology and physical anthropology, applying entirely reasonable scientific skepticism, have generally concluded that these accounts most likely reflect a combination of genuine misidentification of normal human remains under poor field conditions by untrained observers, the well-documented psychological tendency for excavated bones to appear larger than they actually are due to the disorienting effect of seeing disarticulated skeletal material removed from its original context, and in at least some documented cases, deliberate hoaxing for the same commercial and attention-seeking motivations that produced our story's sensationalized 1,893 newspaper account. But the sheer volume and geographic spread of these accounts, hundreds of them scattered across more than a century of regional newspaper archives, each individually weak as evidence, but collectively suggesting some genuine underlying pattern of unusual discoveries that 19th-century observers working without modern forensic training consistently struggle to properly document and explain, mirrors almost exactly the pattern we have traced throughout tonight's story. A genuine phenomenon, whatever its actual underlying explanation turns out to be, encountering a society that lacked both the institutional infrastructure and the cultural motivation to investigate it properly, producing instead a scattered, contradictory, partially fabricated record that later generations find impossible to properly evaluate, using the rigorous standards that modern scholarship rightfully demands. This same basic pattern recurs again in the case of the so-called Michigan relics, a large collection of inscribed clay and slate tablets, along with various metal objects, recovered from sites across southern Michigan beginning in the 1890s, objects that their initial discoverers and a number of enthusiastic early supporters claimed represented evidence of an ancient literate civilization predating any known indigenous culture in the region. This particular case, unlike many of the more vaguely documented giant skeleton reports, was eventually subjected to relatively thorough scientific scrutiny, and the consensus that emerged based on careful analysis of the objects, manufacturing techniques, materials, and the highly suspicious circumstances surrounding many of the original discoveries, concluded that the vast majority, and very possibly the entirety, of the Michigan relics represented a deliberate and surprisingly elaborate hoax, manufactured and planted by individuals connected to the original discoverer for reasons that remain only partially understood, but that appear to have involved both religious motivations connected to certain fringe interpretations of biblical history popular in some circles during this period, and more straightforward financial motivations connected to the sale of these objects to credulous private collectors. The Michigan relics case is worth including in this broader discussion, specifically because it illustrates the other side of the evidentiary coin that any honest investigation of stories, like the Pennsylvania Chamber, must take seriously. Not every claimed discovery from this chaotic, poorly regulated era of American antiquarian interest represents a genuine, if poorly documented, archaeological find. Some represent deliberate fabrication constructed specifically to exploit the same genuine, public fascination with lost American civilizations that make stories like tonight so compelling in the first place. Distinguishing between genuine, if frustratingly underdocumented discoveries, and deliberate hoaxes requires exactly the kind of careful, skeptical analysis of physical evidence, manufacturing technique, and surrounding, circumstantial detail that the Michigan relics eventually received decades after their initial discovery, and that the Pennsylvania Chamber, sealed away before any comparable scientific examination could occur, never had the opportunity to receive at all. This is in the end, perhaps, the single most important honest conclusion this story can offer, more valuable in its own way than any tidy resolution to the central mystery would be. The Pennsylvania discovery occupies a frustrating middle position between cases like the well-documented and ultimately scientifically vindicated mound complexes at sites like Newark, Ohio, which modern archaeology has confirmed beyond reasonable doubt represent genuine, sophisticated indigenous achievement, and cases like the Michigan relics, which careful scientific examination has revealed to be deliberate fabrication. We simply do not, and very likely never will, have enough surviving physical evidence to confidently place the Pennsylvania Chamber into either category with the kind of confidence that responsible historical and archaeological scholarship requires. What we have instead, and what this story has tried to honor throughout tonight's telling, is a careful reconstruction of what can actually be verified from the surviving record, presented alongside an honest accounting of exactly where that record runs out and genuine uncertainty begins. The chamber beneath that Pennsylvania hillside may have contained evidence of a sophisticated, previously undocumented indigenous ceremonial tradition. It may have contained evidence connected to the genuinely unresolved scientific debate over exactly how early humans first arrived in the Americas. It may, less dramatically, but not implausibly, have contained material that a careful, modern forensic and archaeological examination would identify as considerably more mundane and more easily explained than anything the investigator's own honest uncertainty allowed him to confidently rule out. We do not know, and the company's decision to seal that chamber away permanently beneath concrete and rising groundwater means we may genuinely never know, not because the truth is being actively suppressed by any ongoing conspiracy, but because the simple, mundane combination of commercial indifference, institutional limitation, and the slow, patient work of geological time has already closed the door on this particular mystery far more effectively than any deliberate cover-up ever could. There is one further dimension of this story worth sitting with carefully, a dimension that touches on something larger than the Pennsylvania case alone, and that concerns the way 19th-century mining companies across the entire Appalachian coal belt handled the broader question of what to do when their operations encountered anything unusual underground. Whether human remains, unfamiliar rock formations, or objects that did not fit neatly into the geological surveys their engineers relied upon, the pattern that emerges from company records across this period, scattered and incomplete as they are, suggests that what happened beneath our story's central Pennsylvania town was not an isolated approach, but rather a fairly standard institutional response repeated, with minor variations across dozens of similar operations throughout the coal regions of coast Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. During these same decades, mining companies in this era operated under a particular kind of practical philosophy that, while rarely articulated explicitly in any surviving company, document can be reconstructed fairly clearly from the pattern of decisions these companies made when faced with unexpected underground discoveries. The guiding principle, in essence, was containment rather than investigation. The assumption that anything unusual encountered during excavation represented first and foremost a potential liability and a potential distraction from the core business of extracting and selling coal, rather than an opportunity worth pursuing for its own sake. This is not a particularly surprising philosophy for profit-driven industrial enterprises to hold, and it would be unfair, with the benefit of more than a century of hindsight, to judge these companies too harshly for prioritizing their core economic function over a form of scientific curiosity that in most cases would have required resources and expertise these operations simply did not possess and had no practical reason to acquire. But understanding this broader institutional pattern helps explain why our story's central discovery, however significant it may have actually been, followed almost exactly the same trajectory as so many similar incidents scattered across the historical record this period. Brief initial interest, an attempt at quiet, informal investigation by whichever individuals within or adjacent to the company happened to possess sufficient personal curiosity, and then eventually permanent sealing once the practical risks and distractions of the discovery began to outweigh whatever curiosity it had initially generated. This pattern repeated itself with such consistency across the broader coal industry of this era that historians who specialize in the social and economic history of Appalachian mining have given it informal recognition as a recurring feature of how these companies operated. Even though, as with our central story, the specific details of any individual incident rarely survive in enough detail to allow for confident independent verification. It is worth considering too how this pattern intersects with the broader labor conditions that defined mining work throughout this period, conditions that placed enormous pressure on individual miners to avoid exactly the kind of behavior, extended unauthorized investigation, time spent away from productive coal extraction, public discussion of unusual finds that might attract unwanted attention, that our story's central figures nonetheless found themselves drawn toward, despite the very real risks to their employment and economic security. Mining work in this era offered little job security and even less institutional protection for workers who deviated from expected behavior and the willingness of at least two of the men connected to this story. The young miner who continued sharing details with the investigator despite the foreman's instructions for silence, and the investigator himself who persisted in his informal research despite receiving no encouragement from the company and ultimately no support from the official scientific institutions he attempted to contact, represents a genuinely notable departure from what the economic incentives of the era would have predicted. This departure, small and quiet as it was, deserves to be understood as a form of genuine intellectual courage, even though none of the people involved would likely have described their own actions in such grand terms. They were not driven by any abstract commitment to scientific truth or historical preservation in the way a modern academic might frame such motivations. They were driven, as best as we can reconstruct from the fragmentary record, by something closer to simple, stubborn human curiosity. The kind of curiosity that persists even when every practical incentive points toward letting a mystery go unexamined. The kind of curiosity that has throughout human history occasionally produced genuine and lasting contributions to our collective understanding of the world, even when it emerges from people who possess no formal credentials and receive no formal recognition for what they accomplished. This is perhaps one final thread worth carrying forward from tonight's long-telling. The recognition that history's most significant discoveries do not always arrive through the careful, well-funded channels of official scientific institutions, but sometimes arrive instead through the accidental intersection of ordinary working people doing ordinary difficult jobs who happen to encounter something extraordinary and choose against considerable, practical pressure to do otherwise, to pay attention to what they have found, rather than simply looking away and returning to the safer, more predictable rhythm of their daily labor. And yet, even accepting all of this uncertainty honestly, even acknowledging that we may never have the kind of definitive answer that would let this story end cleanly, there remains something genuinely worth reflecting on in how thoroughly this single incident illustrates a much larger truth about the relationship between American industrial expansion and the deeper human history of the continent it was built upon. Consider the sheer scale of underground disruption that the late 19th and early 20th centuries represented across this country. Thousands of mine shafts driven into hillsides from Pennsylvania to Colorado, tens of thousands of miles of railroad cuts blasted through mountain ranges, countless wells, canals, and foundation excavations dug into ground that had in many cases supported continuous or intermittent human habitation for thousands of years before any European settler arrived to claim it. Each one of these projects represented a moment of genuine risk and genuine opportunity for exactly the kind of accidental encounter with buried pre-Columbian history that this story has traced in such careful detail. And the overwhelming majority of these encounters, when they occurred at all, almost certainly played out in exactly the manner this Pennsylvania case did. An untrained worker encountering something unusual, a brief flurry of local curiosity and informal investigation, and then, more often than not, a quiet, practical decision, driven by commercial necessity to simply continue the original project, sealing away or destroying whatever had been found, because properly investigating it would have cost time and money that nobody involved in the project had any institutional incentive to spend. This is not, it bears repeating clearly, evidence of some grand centralized conspiracy to suppress American history. The kind of dramatic coordinated cover-up that certain corners of alternative history discussion sometimes suggest when they encounter cases like this one. The pattern this story illustrates is considerably more mundane and, in some ways, considerably more disturbing precisely because of that mundanity. No single shadowy organization needed to coordinate the suppression of pre-Columbian American history across hundreds of scattered incidents throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The basic economic logic of industrial capitalism, combined with the genuine cultural indifference and outright racial prejudice that characterized how most 19th century Americans understood indigenous achievement, was entirely sufficient on its own to produce exactly this outcome, incident after incident across the entire continent, with no need for any deliberate coordination at all. This distinction matters considerably for how we should think about stories like tonight's going forward. The danger is not that some secret cabal is actively hiding evidence of ancient American civilization from the public, a framing that, however dramatically satisfying it might be, ultimately lets the actual, responsible parties off the hook by transforming a systemic structural problem into a simple narrative of villains and secrets waiting to be exposed by sufficiently determined investigators. The actual danger, the one this story illustrates with genuine and lasting significance, is that an entire society organized its priorities in a way that consistently and predictably destroyed or buried evidence of its own deeper history, not through any deliberate malice in most individual cases, but through the simple, compounding effect of treating economic development as inherently more valuable than historical preservation, treating indigenous achievement as inherently less significant than European achievement, and treating the careful, patient, expensive work of proper archaeological investigation as a luxury that could always be postponed in favor of whatever immediate commercial project happened to be underway. The genuine tragedy embedded in this Pennsylvania story, and in the countless similar, scattered incidents that this story's broader context has tried to illuminate tonight, is not that some specific secret was deliberately hidden, but that an entire category of knowledge, the accumulated material evidence of thousands of years of human habitation and achievement across this continent, was allowed to be destroyed piece by piece, incident by incident, simply because nobody with the power to stop it had sufficient institutional or cultural motivation to do so. The investigator at the center of this story, whatever the ultimate truth of what he actually found, represents one of the very few people from this era who genuinely tried to do better, who recognized, even with his limited training and limited resources, that something significant deserved more careful attention than the company that employed his informants was willing to provide. That his efforts ultimately failed to secure the kind of lasting scientific attention and preservation his discovery may well have deserved is in its own quiet way as much a part of this story's significance as anything he actually found in that sealed Pennsylvania chamber. As we settle now into the later hours of this story, it is worth returning one final time to the human scale of everything we have walked through tonight, away from the broader patterns of industrial expansion and institutional indifference, and back to the four men who stood at the edge of that opening on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in 1891, their lamps throwing small circles of light into a darkness that had been waiting undisturbed for longer than any of them could have imagined. They were not scholars, they were not equipped by training or by temperament for the kind of careful, methodical investigation that a discovery like this would ideally have received. They were working men doing a dangerous and exhausting job in pursuit of nothing more exotic than the modest wages that kept their families fed and housed in a hard, unforgiving company town. And the discovery that found them, rather than the other way around, asked something of them that their entire lives had never prepared them to provide. And yet, in their own halting, uncertain way, they rose to meet it. The oldest among them recognized, with the quiet wisdom that 30 years underground had given him, that this was something beyond his authority to handle alone, and made the difficult choice to retreat rather than push forward into danger and uncertainty that exceeded his ability to manage safely. The younger miner, restless and curious in a way that the surviving record suggests set him, apart from his companions, found within himself the willingness to keep talking, keep remembering, keep sharing what he had seen with someone genuinely interested in understanding it, even when the company that employed him made clear that silence was the safer and more comfortable path. And the original discoverer, the man whose pick first broke through into that ancient waiting darkness, carried what he had experienced quietly across the remainder of a long life, never quite finding the words to fully explain it, even to the people closest to him, but never entirely letting it go either, until finally, in the last years of his life, he offered his grandchild a brief, fragmentary glimpse of what that moment had actually felt like. A glimpse that history, very nearly lost entirely, preserved only by the kind of quiet, patient decades later folklore collection that so much of this story has depended upon. There is something genuinely moving when you sit with it long enough, in recognizing how much of what we know about this entire affair survives. Not because any official institution recognized its importance and took steps to preserve it, but because a series of individual people, an antiquarian investigator who kept careful, private notes for reasons that were never entirely clear, even to himself, a folklorist who took the time to sit with elderly residents and record their fading memories of stories their grandparents had told them, a modern independent historian who spent a decade of his own time and resources trying to track down forgotten archive boxes and obscure mine subsidence records. Each made an individual, largely unrewarded choice to care about preserving something that the larger institutions and economic forces surrounding them had already decided was not worth the trouble. This pattern repeated across this story at every level, from the original investigators, careful notes to the modern researchers' decade of patient archival work, suggests something quietly hopeful, buried within an otherwise frustrating and in many ways disheartening account of institutional failure and lost historical evidence. The truth, or as much of the truth as we are ever likely to recover about what actually happened beneath that Pennsylvania hillside in 1891, survives at all only because individual people, working largely alone and without any official mandate or institutional support, simply refused to let it disappear entirely, even when they had every practical reason to let the matter rest and move on with their own lives instead. If you find yourself in these quiet hours, thinking about the ground beneath your own feet right now, wherever you happen to be listening to this story tonight, that instinct is worth following for a moment before sleep finally takes you. Nearly everywhere across this continent, beneath the foundations of houses, beneath the asphalt of roads, beneath the cellars and basement that most of us never think twice about, there exists the accumulated physical residue of thousands of years of human presence, layer upon layer of habitation, ceremony, daily life, and quiet burial, stretching back far, further than the relatively recent history that fills most American classrooms and most American memory. Most of it will never be found, not because anyone is actively hiding it, but simply because the patient, ordinary business of living, building, and expanding rarely pauses long enough to look carefully at what lies beneath, unless some accident, some unplanned breakthrough, like the one that found our Pennsylvania miner on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, forces that pause upon us. There is, in this thought, both something quietly unsettling and something strangely comforting, the kind of dual feeling that seems to characterize so much of this story when you sit with it, carefully, rather than reaching immediately for either dramatic alarm or dismissive skepticism. Unsettling, because it means an enormous amount of genuine human history, the accumulated evidence of countless lives lived on this continent long before any of the dates and names that fill conventional American history books has likely already been lost, forever, destroyed, not through any dramatic catastrophe, but through the slow, patient, utterly mundane processes of farming, building, mining, and digging that every generation since has carried out without a second thought for what might lie beneath. But comforting too in its own way, because it means that the ground itself still holds far more than we currently know, that the story of this continent remains in some genuine and meaningful sense, still unfinished, still capable of producing new discoveries, new fragments, new unexpected breakthroughs into spaces that have been quietly waiting, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for far longer than that, for someone to finally notice them. The four miners who stood at that opening in 1891 did not set out that Tuesday afternoon looking for any of this. They were looking for coal, the same ordinary, practical, economically necessary substance that had defined their working lives and the working lives of nearly everyone in their small Pennsylvania town. What they found instead, whatever its ultimate nature and significance, was a reminder, delivered entirely by accident, that the ground beneath even the most ordinary, most economically unremarkable corners of this country can still hold something genuinely extraordinary, something that connects the hurried, industrial present of blast furnaces and breaker towers directly back to a much older, much quieter human story that the modern world had, by 1891, almost entirely forgotten how to listen for. Let us return now briefly to that ridge mentioned earlier in this story, the same stretch of rocky, difficult ground that the area's earliest farmers had quietly avoided for generations before the coal company ever arrived. The same ridge whose hollow drum-like quality and faint unexplained lights had passed down, through local memory, long before anyone connected it to what would eventually be found in the valley below. The regional folklorist, whose work has been referenced throughout this account, spent considerable additional effort, beyond what has already been described, attempting to trace exactly how far back this particular piece of local folklore actually extended, and his findings preserved in his own published collection of regional folklore from this part of Pennsylvania suggests something genuinely worth sitting with as we move toward the final portion of tonight's story. According to the earliest documentation he was able to locate, dating to interviews conducted with elderly residents in the early decades of the 20th century, who were themselves recalling stories told to them by their own grandparents. The caution surrounding that ridge predated not just the coal mining operation, but the very earliest European settlement of the area entirely. Several of his interview subjects recalled their grandparents describing conversations held sometime in the early 19th century when European settlement of this specific valley was still relatively recent, with members of the indigenous community who had remained in the broader region following the initial waves of displacement that had pushed most of the area's original inhabitants further west by that point. These conversations, as remembered and passed down across multiple generations before, finally being recorded by the folklorist, suggested that the indigenous residents themselves understood the ridge as a place that had been avoided for reasons connected to inherited tradition rather than any specific incident within living memory at that time for as long as anyone could recall. This detail, fragile and heavily filtered through multiple generations of oral transmission, as it admittedly is, nonetheless carries genuine weight for understanding the broader significance of this story, because it suggests, if taken seriously, that whatever quality the ridge and the chamber beneath the adjacent valley actually possessed, the avoidance and caution surrounding it was not simply a reaction to the 1891 mining discovery itself, retroactively projected backward through folklore in the way that local legends sometimes do, but rather represented a genuinely older tradition, one that predated European settlement entirely, and that may have connected in ways we can no longer fully reconstruct, to whatever original indigenous understanding of that space existed before the chamber was ever sealed away, whether by natural collapse, deliberate concealment, or some combination of both. In the centuries or millennia before any coal company ever arrived to disturb it, the folklorist himself, careful and appropriately cautious in his own published conclusions, in a manner that echoes the same intellectual honesty we have seen throughout this story in the original investigator's notes, declined to draw any firm conclusion about what this older tradition of avoidance actually meant, or what specific knowledge, if any, it preserved about the chamber's original purpose. He noted reasonably that traditions of avoiding specific places for reasons connected to spiritual significance, historical memory of past events, or simple practical concerns about unstable or dangerous terrain are common across countless indigenous communities throughout North America, and do not by themselves constitute evidence of any specific buried structure or artifact. But he also noted with what reads as genuine scholarly fascination, rather than any attempt to oversell his findings, that the specific correspondence between this older avoidance tradition and the precise location where the 1891 discovery eventually occurred was, in his words, a correlation worth taking seriously, even if it could never on its own be elevated into confident proof of any particular explanation. This thread, the quiet, multi-generational indigenous memory of a place worth avoiding, sitting directly above ground that 19th-century industrial miners would eventually breach by accident in pursuit of coal, adds one final layer of genuine, unresolved mystery to a story that has, throughout tonight's telling, consistently resisted easy resolution at every turn. It suggests, however speculatively, that the people who actually knew this landscape best, whose ancestors had lived alongside it for far longer than any European settler or coal company had any claim to understanding it, may have carried forward across countless generations of careful oral tradition an awareness of something significant beneath that ridge that the rest of the world would not stumble into by pure industrial accident until a hot Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1891, when four tired men, looking for nothing more than the next seam of coal, broke through into a darkness that in some sense the historical record can never fully confirm, but also cannot entirely dismiss, may have been quietly, patiently waiting for them all along. Before we move toward the close of tonight's story, it is worth slowing down even further and spending some time inside the texture of daily life in that Pennsylvania coal town. Because understanding the rhythm of that world, to the world these four men inhabited every single day before and after their strange encounter underground, helps us understand exactly how disruptive and how genuinely disorienting their discovery must have felt set against the backdrop of lives that otherwise followed an almost unchanging predictable pattern, shaped entirely by the demands of the mine and the company that owned it. The working day in a town like this began long before dawn, particularly in the winter months, when the sun rose late over the surrounding hills, and the men needed to be at the shaft entrance, lamps lit and ready, well before the first hint of grey light touched the sky. Breakfast for most mining families in this period was a quick and practical affair. Thick bread, sometimes with a thin spread of lard, or molasses, if the family budget allowed for. Nothing richer, washed down with strong, cheap coffee, or in households that kept to older traditions brought over from Wales or Germany, or wherever the family had originally immigrated from, a thin porridge that could be prepared quickly over a wood stove that had usually been kept smouldering through the night for exactly this purpose. The walk to the shaft entrance for men living in the company housing that clustered close around most mining operations of this era rarely took more than 15 or 20 minutes. But it was a walk conducted in near silence. By every account from this period, men saving their breath and their energy for the work ahead, rather than spending it on conversation that could wait until the shift ended. The descent into the mine itself, accomplished by a cage system, lowered on cables that groaned and rattled in ways that, after enough repetitions, most men learned to stop consciously hearing, took the workers down, through layers of rock that grew progressively older and stranger the deeper they went, past the relatively recent geological formations near the surface, into the much older anthracite-bearing strata that had formed, as modern geology has since confirmed with considerable precision, over the course of many tens of millions of years of accumulated organic deposition and gradual compression beneath the slow, patient pressure of an ancient and long since vanished, swampy coastal landscape that none of these men, working with the limited geological education available to ordinary laborers in this period, would have had any real way to fully appreciate or understand. Once at the working face, the actual labor of mining anthracite coal involved a combination of careful, skilled handwork and increasingly by this period mechanical and explosive assistance that had transformed the industry considerably over the preceding several decades. A skilled miner would examine the coalace carefully before beginning work, reading the seam for weaknesses and natural fracture lines, the same way the most experienced men, like the oldest miner present at our story's central discovery, had learned to read the warning signs of unstable rock and dangerous gas pockets. Drilling holes for blasting charges required precision, since a poorly placed charge could waste valuable coal by shattering it into pieces too small to sell, or could fail to bring down the targeted section at all, wasting both the expensive blasting powder and the time required to drill new holes and try again. After a blast, the real physical labor began, loading the broken coal by hand into small carts that ran on narrow rail tracks back toward the Fenne Ryan shaft. Work that demanded sustained physical exertion in cramped, often barely lit conditions, frequently while kneeling or crouching in spaces too low for a grown man to stand fully upright. This was the unglamorous, exhausting reality of anthracite mining in 1891. A reality that makes the discovery at the center of this story even more remarkable when you consider that it interrupted, however briefly, exactly this kind of grinding, repetitive physical labor, transforming an ordinary workday into something that none of the four men involved would ever fully process or forget for the remainder of their lives. The end of a shift brought its own particular rhythm, the ascent back to the surface, the brief but cherished moment of removing a lamp that had been clipped to a cap for 10 or 12 hours straight, and then, For most men, a walk to the company store to purchase whatever provisions the family needed for the evening meal, often on credit against future wages, in a system that left many mining families in a state of chronic, low-level debt to the very company that employed them. A detail that matters for understanding why the four miners at the center of this story would have had genuine practical reasons to be cautious about anything that might jeopardize their continued employment, including very plausibly a discovery that might have made them appear unreliable, superstitious, or simply difficult in the eyes of a company that held considerable power over their economic survival. Evenings in this kind of company town followed their own quiet pattern. Families gathered around whatever modest heat source the household could afford, children doing what schoolwork was available to them in towns that often provided only limited and irregular educational opportunities for the children of mining families, and the adults exhausted from the day's labor, generally retiring early in preparation for the same demanding routine that would begin again before the next dawn. It was within this exhausting, repetitive, economically precarious rhythm of daily life that our story's central discovery occurred. A single, genuinely extraordinary interruption, breaking through the otherwise relentless sameness of industrial labor in a way that none of the men involved could have anticipated when they descended into the shaft that ordinary Tuesday morning lamps lit, expecting nothing more than another day of the same hard, familiar work they had performed thousands of times before. It is worth pausing now to consider, more slowly than we have so far in this story, the genuinely staggering depth of time represented by the rock these men spent their working lives cutting through, because understanding that deep geological context adds yet another layer to the strangeness of what they eventually found. The anthrate coal of northeastern Pennsylvania did not form quickly, and it did not form recently, even by the generous standards of human historical memory that stretch back only a few thousand years at most. The organic material that would eventually become this particular coal began accumulating. According to the careful work of generations of geologists who have studied this specific region in considerable detail during the Carboniferous period, an era that drew to a close roughly 300 million years before any human being anywhere on the planet would walk upright, across the African savanna, where our own species would eventually emerge. During that almost unimaginably distant period, the landscape that would one day become Pennsylvania looked nothing like the rolling forested hills familiar to anyone who has visited the region today. It existed instead as a vast, low-lying coastal swamp choked with primitive plant life entirely unlike anything alive on Earth today. Towering club mosses and ferns reaching heights that would seem more appropriate for a modern, hardwood forest, growing in dense, tangled profusion across a humid equatorial climate. Because the landmass that would eventually drift northward and become North America sat, during this ancient period, considerably closer to the planet's equator than it does today, carried slowly across the surface of the globe over the subsequent hundreds of millions of years by the same grinding, patient process of continental drift that continues almost imperceptibly to reshape the planet's surface even now. As these ancient swamp forests grew and died generation after generation across millions of years, their organic remains accumulated in thick layers within the oxygen-poor, waterlogged soil of the swamp floor, preventing the normal process of decomposition that would otherwise have broken this plant material down entirely. Over time, as these layers accumulated and were buried beneath subsequent deposits of sediment, the immense pressure and heat generated by this burial gradually transformed the original plant material first into peat, then into the softer bituminous coal found in many other parts of the world, and finally, in this specific region of Pennsylvania, where the geological conditions proved unusually intense, into the harder, purer anthrate that would eventually draw mining companies to sink shafts deep into these hills throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. This process required not merely millions, but hundreds of millions of years to complete, an almost incomprehensible span of deep geological time that dwarfs by a margin that the human mind struggles to genuinely internalize even the most ancient and significant moments of human history that this story has explored tonight. The mound builders of the Ohio Valley building their sophisticated earthworks some 2,000 years ago. The earliest confirmed human presence in North America, stretching back at minimum 13,000 years, and very possibly considerably further into the genuinely contested territory of the pre-Clovis debate discussed earlier in this story. Even these genuinely ancient human timescales represent only the faintest, most recent sliver of time when set against the hundreds of millions of years required to transform an ancient swamp forest into the anthroid coal that our foreminers spent their working lives extracting from deep beneath the Pennsylvania hills. And yet within this almost unfathomably ancient rock, formed long before any human being or even any recognizable mammal walked the earth, these four men encountered evidence, however ambiguous and however incompletely documented, of comparatively recent human activity, structures, and objects that, whatever their precise page turns out to have been, represent a timescale of mere centuries, or perhaps thousands of years, a fleeting, almost impossibly brief moment, when set against the deep geological context of the rock that surrounded, and in some sense, had patiently protected and concealed that human activity for so long. This juxtaposition, the genuinely ancient rock encountering the comparatively recent human story buried within or alongside it, captures something that this entire narrative has circled around. From its opening moments, the way that human history, however far back it actually extends, remains only the briefest, most recent chapter within the much vaster and much older story of the planet itself. A planet that has been patiently recording its own history, layer by layer, for far longer than human memory or even human imagination can comfortably encompass. Let us turn our attention now for a time to the actual documented human history of this specific region of Pennsylvania. The history that existed long before any coal company arrived, and long before the chamber beneath that ridge was ever sealed away. Because understanding this confirmed historical context helps ground the more speculative elements of tonight's story in something considerably more solid and verifiable. The broader region of northeastern Pennsylvania, in the centuries immediately preceding sustained European contact, fell within the territory and cultural sphere of several related indigenous nations, most prominently the Susquehannock people, whose name itself, adapted by early European settlers, derives from their long association with the Susquehanna River that drains much of this region, and whose villages, according to the archaeological and historical record that has been carefully reconstructed by researchers over the past century, were substantial, well-organized settlements supporting populations considerably larger than the popular imagination, shaped as it has been by exactly the kind of dismissive 19th-century attitudes discussed earlier in this story, typically credits to pre-Columbian indigenous societies in this part of the country. The Susquehannock, linguistically and culturally related to the broader Iroquois language family, that also included the more famous Five Nations Confederacy to the north, maintained a sophisticated agricultural economy centered on the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash. The so-called Three Sisters cultivation system that supported large semi-permanent villages and allowed for the kind of population density and social organization that made monumental construction projects, including substantial earthwork fortifications around many of their settlements, genuinely feasible. European accounts from the earliest period of sustained contact, including detailed descriptions left by Swedish and Dutch traders and explorers who encountered Susquehannock settlements along the river in the early 17th century, described palisaded villages containing what these European observers estimated, with whatever accuracy their unfamiliarity with the culture allowed, as several thousand residents in some of the largest settlements, organized around long houses constructed using sophisticated timber framing techniques that had considerable collective labor. and engineering knowledge to construct successfully. This is the genuine, well-documented historical context that surrounded the specific Pennsylvania Valley where our story's central mining operation eventually took place. A context of substantial, sophisticated, agriculturally based indigenous civilization that had occupied this landscape for many centuries before any European settler arrived, and that, tragically, would be devastated within just a few decades of sustained contact, not primarily through direct military conflict, though that certainly occurred, but through the same catastrophic waves of European-introduced disease that swept through indigenous populations across the entire continent following initial contact, reducing populations that had taken centuries to build through epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other diseases to which indigenous Americans had no prior immunity. In some documented cases, eliminating well over 90% of a given population within a single generation. By the time the area around our story's mining town had passed fully into European and later American control, the Susquehannock, as a distinct, organized political and cultural entity, had been almost entirely destroyed. Their surviving populations scattered, absorbed into neighboring indigenous nations, or relocated through the same patterns of forced displacement that affected indigenous communities across the entire eastern portion of the continent throughout the colonial and early American period. The handful of indigenous residents who remained in the broader region by the early 19th century, the same period during which, according to the folklore discussed earlier in this story, conversations occurred regarding the ridge, significance, and the traditions of avoidance surrounding it, represented only the smallest, most attenuated remnant of what had once been a substantial and sophisticated regional civilization. This historical context matters enormously for properly understanding the broader significance of tonight's story, because it means that whatever the chamber beneath that Pennsylvania ridge actually contained, it existed within a landscape that had genuinely supported substantial, organized, technologically and socially sophisticated human civilization for many centuries, quite possibly for a considerably longer span of time, extending back into the more distant and less well-documented woodland period traditions discussed earlier. Traditions connected to the broader mound-building cultures of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. The chamber did not need to represent evidence of some exotic, unknown, or impossible civilization to be genuinely significant. It needed only to represent a previously undocumented physical trace of the very real, very substantial indigenous civilizations that we already know. Through extensive and increasingly well-documented archaeological and historical research, occupied this landscape for many generations before the arrival of the coal companies that would eventually, almost by accident, breach into whatever remained of their physical legacy, deep beneath a hillside that had patiently kept its secrets long after the people who built whatever lay within it had themselves been scattered, displaced, and largely erased from the historical memory of the nation that replaced them. As tonight's story draws closer to its end, it is worth gathering together one final time the legends threads we have followed through this long, winding account, because a story this layered, covering as it does more than a century of scattered evidence, competing theories, and genuine unresolved uncertainty, benefits from a moment of quiet reflection before we let it finally settle into rest, alongside everything else this evening has carried. We began with 4 exhausted men standing at the edge of an opening that should not have existed, their lamps casting small circles of light into a darkness that had been waiting by every reasonable estimate available to us for a span of time considerably longer than any of them could meaningfully comprehend. We traced the careful, honest, frequently self-doubting investigation conducted by an amateur antiquarian whose private notes represent more than a century later still the single, most detailed and most credible account of what that chamber actually contained. An account that resists at every turn the temptation toward easy sensationalism that would eventually overtake the public version of this story once it passed into the hands of a newspaper editor. More concerned with selling copies than with preserving accuracy, we considered carefully, and without rushing toward full certainty, the range of explanations that might account for what was actually found beneath that hillside, from the straightforward and well-supported possibility of a previously undocumented indigenous ceremonial site connected to the genuine, sophisticated, and tragically diminished civilizations that we know occupied this landscape for centuries before European contact, through the more speculative, but still scientifically legitimate possibility of evidence connected to the genuinely unresolved debate over exactly how early humans first arrived in the Americas, and finally, to the more exotic and considerably less credible claims that later embellishment attached to this story, claims that the available evidence simply does not support, no matter how many times they have been repeated across the decades of retelling that followed the original 1893 newspaper sensationalism. We followed the quiet, largely unrewarded persistence of the people who kept this story alive, against considerable institutional indifference. The original investigator, whose careful notes sat largely unknown for decades, the folklorist who took the time to sit with elderly residents and preserve their fading memories before those memories were lost entirely, and the modern independent historian whose decade of patient archival research succeeded in confirming what could still be verified, while honestly acknowledging the considerable limits of what modern investigation can actually accomplish, given the chamber's apparent, permanent inaccessibility beneath rising groundwater and collapsed mine workings. And we considered throughout this entire account the broader pattern this single Pennsylvania case fits into, a pattern of careless, accidental industrial encounters with pre-Columbian American history, repeated across dozens of similar incidents throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, almost none of which received the kind of careful, well-resourced scientific attention that might have settled their significance definitively. Not because of any coordinated conspiracy to suppress this history, but because of the simple, compounding, and in its own way more troubling reality that American society during this period organized its priorities in a manner that consistently treated economic development as more valuable than historical preservation and indigenous achievement as less significant than the relentless pursuit of industrial progress. There is one more thread worth following before we let this story finally rest. A thread that takes us slightly beyond what the surviving historical record can strictly verify into the realm of careful, honest speculation that this story has tried throughout tonight's telling to clearly distinguish from established fact. It concerns the question of what might still remain, not in any physically accessible sense, since we have already discussed at length why the flooded, collapsed remains of that original shaft make any direct modern investigation essentially impossible without resources and institutional commitment that nobody has yet provided, but in the sense of what other, similarly sealed and forgotten spaces might still exist, scattered across this same general region of Pennsylvania, and indeed across the broader landscape of the eastern United States, waiting for their own accidental discovery that may or may not ever come. The geological conditions that produced the chamber beneath our story's central ridge were not, by any reasonable scientific assessment, unique to that single specific location. The broader anthroid region of northeastern Pennsylvania contains, according to the careful surveys conducted by the state's Geological Service over the past century, an extensive and genuinely complex network of natural fractures, voids, and underground water channels running through the same general rock formations that our story's mining operation encountered. Formations that extend across a considerably larger area than the single valley where this particular discovery occurred. If the chamber beneath our story's ridge represented genuine evidence of ancient human use and habitation, accessed originally through some now collapsed or deliberately concealed surface entrance before later geological processes buried it beneath the depth that 19th-century mining would eventually reach by accident, there is no obvious reason, based purely on the underlying geology why similar spaces might not exist elsewhere across this same broader region. Equally undiscovered, equally inaccessible to casual investigation, and equally dependent on some future accidental breakthrough, whether through renewed mining activity, infrastructure construction, or simple geological subsidence before their existence might ever come to light. This possibility, speculative as it remains, connects to a broader pattern that researchers, specializing in what we have called, throughout tonight's story, the forbidden or suppressed archaeology of pre-Columbian North America, have noted with some consistency across multiple regions of the country. The observation that genuine archaeological significance often correlates in ways that should not be surprising, once you think carefully about it, with exactly the kind of geological features that later industrial activity finds most attractive for entirely unrelated economic reasons. Caves and natural rock shelters that provided shelter and ceremonial space for ancient peoples often sit within the same limestone and similar rock formations that later attracted quarrying operations. River valleys that supported substantial pre-Columbian agricultural settlements. Exactly the kind of settlements the Susquehannock maintained throughout this region frequently became the same river valleys that later industrial development found most valuable for transportation, water power, and eventually railroad construction. The same landscape features that made a location valuable to ancient peoples for entirely practical reasons, connected to water access, defensible terrain, and agricultural fertility, often made that same landscape valuable to later industrial society for closely related practical reasons, creating exactly the kind of overlap that this story has traced throughout its long, winding account. The overlap between where ancient human history actually occurred and where modern, industrial expansion was most likely to accidentally encounter physical evidence of it. This overlap suggests, with whatever degree of confidence the genuinely incomplete evidence allows, that the chamber beneath our stories, Pennsylvania Ridge, was very likely not a singular unique anomaly, but rather one instance, one accidentally discovered fragment of a considerably larger and more widely distributed pattern of pre-Columbian human activity across this region. A pattern that the vast majority of which remains even now, more than a century after our story's central events, entirely undiscovered, sealed away, beneath ground that has not yet experienced the particular combination of circumstances, industrial excavation, geological subsidence, or deliberate investigation that would be required to bring it back into the light. As we come now to the close of this long telling, let your mind settle, if it will, on that image we began with. 4 men standing at the edge of an opening in the dark, lamps held forward, the small circle of light reaching only so far before the darkness simply continued, patient and unbothered, exactly as it had for however many centuries or millennia had passed, since anyone had last stood in that space and looked back at them. That image, more than any specific theory or any specific object recovered from those careful niches in the deeper chamber, captures something essential about what this story has tried to offer tonight. Not a resolution, not a tidy answer that lets you close this chapter with full confidence about exactly what happened beneath that Pennsylvania hillside, but something closer to an invitation to sit comfortably with genuine uncertainty, to find something worthwhile, and even something quietly restful, in a mystery that does not insist on resolving itself before you are ready to let your own thoughts drift elsewhere. The ground beneath this country, beneath every country, holds far more than any single human lifetime could ever hope to fully uncover. Layer upon layer of accumulated time and accumulated human presence, stretching back through the documented, careful history of indigenous civilizations like the Susquehanna, back through the genuinely ancient and still actively debated questions of exactly when humans first arrived on this continent, back further still through hundreds of millions of years of deep geological time, recorded in the very anthrate that drew an entire industry and an entire way of life into these Pennsylvania hills in the first place. Within all of that accumulated time, within all of that patient, layered history, our 4 miners encountered one small, genuinely uncertain fragment, carefully documented, by a man who never received the recognition his careful work likely deserved, sealed away again, before the world could properly understand what it had briefly glimpsed and preserved against every reasonable expectation, only because a handful of people across the following century cared enough to keep its memory alive. That is where we leave this story tonight. Not at an ending exactly, but at the same kind of patient, unresolved pause that has characterized this entire account from its very first moments. 4 men, standing at the edge of the dark. The rest of us more than a century later, still standing at the edge of our own understanding, peering forward into a history that remains. In this specific case, and in countless others, scattered across this entire continent, genuinely, frustratingly, and perhaps in its own quiet way, beautifully unfinished. Let your thoughts drift now, if they will, to the wider darkness that sits beneath so much of the world around you, not just in Pennsylvania, not just in coal country, but everywhere. Under every city, under every quiet country road, under the very room where you might be lying right now, as this story carries you towards sleep. Somewhere beneath the modern world, beneath the highways and the shopping centers, and the neighborhoods that feel so permanent and so thoroughly known, there are almost certainly other chambers, like the one our 4 miners found. Other passages worked smooth by hands that stopped moving long before anyone alive today was born. Other niches, holding objects that nobody currently walking the surface of this continent has ever seen or touched. Most of them will likely remain exactly as they are, sealed, silent, patient for longer than any of us will live to see, resolved. And there is something in that thought that asks for a certain kind of peace rather than frustration. The same peace, perhaps, that the original investigator seemed to find in his own later years, when he wrote that he did not regret what he had been permitted to witness, even knowing the world around him would likely never fully appreciate it. Think for a moment longer about the particular quality of silence that must have filled that chamber in the centuries before 1891. A silence broken only by whatever slow, almost imperceptible processes were occurring within the rock itself. Water finding new paths through ancient fractures, mineral deposits forming microscopic layers across stone surfaces that had not felt the touch of a human hand, since whoever built that space last walked away from it, for reasons we will never know, carrying with them whatever knowledge, whatever ceremony, whatever ordinary daily purpose had brought them there in the first place. That silence persisted, unbroken and complete, through the entire sweep of subsequent human history on this continent, through the rise and fall of the Susuanic villages along the river, through the arrival of European settlers and the slow, often violent transformation of the landscape that followed, through the construction of the very cold town that would eventually rise above that buried chamber without anyone in it having the faintest idea what rested beneath their feet, until finally, on one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, a blast charge hacked through stone that had held its silence for longer than anyone could measure, and for one brief disorienting moment, that ancient quiet met the modern world, lamplight meeting darkness that had never expected to be found. And then, just as quickly, the silence returned. The passage was sealed, first with timber, later with concrete, and the groundwater rose slowly over the following decades to finish what the company's deliberate sealing had begun, returning that chamber to something close to the same, undisturbed state it had occupied for however many centuries or millennia preceded its brief, accidental rediscovery. In a sense, Juamba has now spent more total time in that final modern silence, sealed beneath concrete and rising water, than it spent open to human knowledge and investigation during the brief window between 1891 and the early years of the 20th century, when the company finally closed it away for good. The mystery did not end because it was solved. It ended in the most practical and final sense available to it, because the world simply moved on. The way the world tends to do with most mysteries, it is not sufficiently motivated to resolve, leaving behind only the patient, careful, partial record that a small handful of people across the following century cared enough to preserve, and leaving the rest of us tonight to sit with everything that remains genuinely, permanently unknown. There is a particular comfort, I think, in stories that end this way. Stories that do not insist on tying every thread into a neat and satisfying conclusion, because real history, the actual history of this continent, and of the countless human lives that have passed across it, rarely offers the clean resolution that fiction so often provides. The four miners who stood at that opening in 1891 lived out the remainder of their lives carrying an experience they never fully understood, and in carrying it, in choosing in their own halting and imperfect ways to remember it, and occasionally share fragments of it with people they trusted, they ensured that some small portion of what they witnessed survived long enough to reach you tonight, more than a century later, drifting towards sleep, while their strange, unresolved discovery settles quietly into your own thoughts. One more layer added to the long accumulated history of a story that may never be fully told, but that for tonight at least, has been carried just a little further forward, kept alive for one more generation of curious minds, willing to sit with its uncertainty rather than demanding it, resolve into something simpler than the truth likely ever was. Consider, as we move toward the very last moments of this story, how strange it is that the only reason any of this reaches you at all is because of a chain of small, almost accidental human choices stretching across more than a century, each one fragile, each one easily broken at any point along the way. If the foreman had simply destroyed the worked stone fragment, instead of mailing it to a private contact, if that letter had been lost or thrown away rather than tucked, seemingly by accident, into the pages of an unrelated ledger that happened to survive a later fire, if the investigator had never bothered to write down his own careful self-doubting reflections, or if those later pages, discovered decades afterward in an uncatalogued donation box, had simply been discarded by some historical society volunteer who saw nothing more than old, illegible handwriting, not worth the shelf space. If the folklorist had never taken the time to sit with elderly residents whose memories of the Ridge legend would otherwise have died with them, unrecorded and unreoverable. If the modern independent historian had never developed the specific, patient curiosity required to spend a decade chasing down old mind maps and groundwater records for a story that offered him no obvious professional reward beyond the simple satisfaction of understanding something a little more completely than before. Each one of these moments represents a point where this story could have simply vanished, joining the countless other scattered, half-documented incidents from across this same, general period of American industrial expansion that left behind no trace sufficient for anyone to ever reconstruct what actually happened. The fact that this particular story survived, fragmentary and uncertain as it remains, owes everything to a series of individual people who, for reasons that often had little to do with any grand sense of historical mission, simply chose curiosity over convenience, chose preservation over disposal, chose the quiet, unglamorous work of writing things down and keeping old records over the much easier path of letting an inconvenient mystery simply fade away into the same silence that had already swallowed it once before. This is in its own way, perhaps, the truest lesson this story has to offer, more durable and more broadly applicable than any specific theory about ancient chambers or pre-Columbian civilizations. History survives, not because it is important in some abstract predetermined sense that guarantees its own preservation, but because individual people, scattered across generations, make the small, often unrewarded choice to remember, to record, to ask one more question before letting a thread go entirely. The four miners who made the original discovery in 1891 could not have known that their brief, frightening experience underground would eventually reach listeners more than 130 years later, carried forward through exactly this kind of fragile, accumulated chain of individual care. And yet here we are tonight, still thinking about that small circle of lamplight pushing against an ancient darkness, still wondering the same way the investigator himself wondered in his own careful private, notes exactly what those 4 exhausted men had actually found waiting for them in the depths of that Pennsylvania hillside. Perhaps that is enough for tonight. Perhaps the wondering itself, carried gently and without urgency, toward whatever conclusions you find most reasonable, is the appropriate place to leave this story resting, at least until sleep finally arrives and carries your own thoughts somewhere else entirely, somewhere quieter, somewhere this particular chamber of buried American history can simply settle into the same patient, undisturbed darkness it has occupied for most of its long, largely unknown existence, waiting perhaps for whatever the future eventually decides. It's to do with whatever still remains of it. If you have stayed with this story this far into the night, drifting somewhere between full wakefulness and the soft edges of sleep, I would love to know where you are listening from right now and what time it happens to be where you are. I always read through the comments, and there is something quietly remarkable about realizing how many different places, how many different time zones are connected by this same slow telling at this exact moment. Someone in the eastern United States, perhaps not far from the very hills this story describes, someone across the ocean in Europe, where the morning may already be breaking, someone on the other side of the world, where the afternoon sun is still high. It is a strange and gentle kind of connection. All of us scattered across the globe, brought together briefly by a story about 4 men and a small circle of lamplight, pushing against an old, patient darkness in the Pennsylvania hills. It is worth, in these final quiet minutes, returning once more to the specific texture of that moment in 1891, because it is the kind of moment that rewards slow, careful imagining rather than quick summary. Picture the air in that passage, thick with the dust that any fresh blast inevitably produces, the smell of spent blasting powder, mixing with whatever faint, unfamiliar mineral scent the chamber itself carried, the kind of smell that more than one miner in this story described as resembling old water, water that had been sitting undisturbed for far longer than any of them could properly imagine. Picture the particular quality of sound in that space, the way their own breathing and their own careful footsteps seemed to echo back at them from directions that did not quite match where the walls should have been. The disorienting layered quality of acoustics in a large, irregular underground chamber that none of them had any prior experience navigating. Picture, too, the specific, very human fear that must have accompanied even the most curious and determined among them, a fear not of any specific identified threat, since nothing in the surviving record suggests they encountered anything overtly dangerous within that chamber, but the deeper, more primal fear that comes from finding yourself somewhere genuinely unprecedented, somewhere your accumulated experience and training have not prepared you to properly interpret. Every instinct these men had developed across years of underground work was built around reading natural stone, natural gas pockets, natural patterns of collapse and stability. None of that hard-won instinct applied cleanly to a space that had clearly been shaped by deliberate human hands, by purposes and techniques entirely unfamiliar to them, sealed away, for a length of time that defied easy comparison to anything in their own lived experience. And yet, even within that fear, the surviving accounts suggest something closer to wonder than to panic. A careful, curious engagement with the unknown that speaks well of these men, working people with no formal education in archaeology or geology, who nonetheless approached something genuinely extraordinary, with patience, with care, and with enough presence of mind to retreat when caution demanded it, rather than push forward recklessly into danger they could not properly assess. That balance between genuine fear and genuine curiosity, between caution and the pull of discovery, runs through this entire story, from its very first moments to its final unresolved conclusion. And it captures something true, not just about this specific incident in 1891, but about the broader human relationship with mystery itself. The way we are drawn forward by the unknown, even as some older, more cautious part of us counsels patience, counsels care, counsels the kind of slow, deliberate investigation that the 4 miners managed in their own imperfect way to practice. That long ago Tuesday afternoon, this story, more than a century old now, carried forward through fragile letters and forgotten archive boxes, and the patient work of folklorists and independent historians who simply refuse to let it disappear entirely, asks nothing more of you tonight than the same patient curiosity those four men brought to their own brief, strange encounter with the unknown. Not certainty, not resolution, just the willingness to sit for a little while longer at the edge of something genuinely uncertain, and to find somewhere within that uncertainty a kind of quiet comfort rather than frustration, the same comfort the original investigator himself eventually found in his own later years, when he wrote that he did not regret what he had been permitted to witness, even knowing the world around him would likely never fully understand its significance. Let this be, then, the final image we carry forward from tonight's long telling. Not the sensationalized underground temple of the 1893 newspaper article with its invented treasure and its baseless claims of sacrifice. A version of the story built for excitement rather than truth. Not the wilder fringe theories that later decades would attach to this case. Theories that the careful surviving historical record simply does not support, no matter how many times they have been repeated across the corners of the internet, where this story occasionally resurfaces. Instead, simply this: four tired men, working an ordinary shift in an ordinary Pennsylvania coal town, breaking through by pure accident into a darkness considerably older than anything their own lives or their own century had prepared them to understand. A careful, curious investigator, working largely alone and without institutional support, doing his honest best to document what he found before the world around him sealed it away again, this time for good. A chain of small, fragile, almost accidental acts of preservation, stretching across more than 100 years, that allowed at least some fragment of this story to survive long enough to reach you tonight. Somewhere beneath that Pennsylvania hillside, beneath rising groundwater and collapsed timber and a century of accumulated silence, whatever remains of that chamber continues to rest exactly as it has rested for most of its long, mostly unknown existence, undisturbed, patient, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone above ever fully understands what it once held. That patience in its own quiet way is perhaps the most fitting note to end on tonight. The reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved quickly, or perhaps even solved at all, within any single human lifetime, but are instead meant to be carried gently and without urgency from one curious mind to the next, across however many generations it takes for the full truth, if a full truth even exists, to be found, to finally come to light, or to simply remain, as it has for so long now, quietly and permanently its own. Let your thoughts settle now. Let the image of that small circle of lamplight fade gently into whatever dreams the rest of this night has waiting for you. The story has been told as carefully and as honestly as the surviving evidence allows. And whatever you choose to believe about what those four miners actually found in 1891, the simple accumulated fact of their experience, preserved against considerable odds across more than a century of silence, indifference, and slow institutional forgetting, is itself a kind of quiet testament to how much of this continent's deeper history still waits beneath our feet, patient, undisturbed, and entirely capable of surprising us again whenever the ground next happens to give way. Before we close tonight's telling completely, it is worth acknowledging one last time just how many small threads this single story has touched. Threads that reach back through the deep geological time recorded in that ancient anthrate, through the sophisticated, tragically diminished civilizations of the Susquehanna and their neighboring nations, through the genuinely contested scientific debate over the earliest peopling of this continent, through the careless, accidental pattern of industrial discovery and institutional indifference that scattered similar incidents across this country throughout an entire era of rapid, careless expansion, and finally, through the fragile accumulated chain of individual human care, an antiquarian's private notes, a folklorist's patient interviews, a modern historian's decade of quiet archival persistence that allowed even this much of the story to survive long. Enough to reach you tonight, drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, carrying this small fragment of buried American history forward into whatever dreams the rest of this night still has waiting for you. Whatever those four men actually found beneath that Pennsylvania hillside in 1891, whatever the truth of that sealed and flooded chamber ultimately turns out to be, if it is ever resolved at all, the story itself, carried this far by so many careful, unrewarded hands across more than a century, has already accomplished something quietly remarkable simply by surviving. It has reminded us gently, and without insisting on any particular conclusion, that the ground beneath this entire continent still holds far more than any single generation could hope to fully know. That history remains, in the most genuine sense, still unfinished, and that somewhere out there, beneath some other quiet hillside or some other forgotten valley, another small circle of lamplight may yet someday push back against another patient darkness that has been waiting just as long, just as quietly for its own turn to finally be found. If you're here to relax or drift off to sleep, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. That's why I create these videos. If you enjoy calm journeys through history, consider subscribing, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far these stories travel around the world.